Yeah, that's a good reminder. Just saw one of the pop-ups, but yeah, Tim and Sarah, if you can do the same old recording thing, just to have the backup to the backup. And yeah, for everyone that just joined, we're giving it a couple of seconds here for the YouTube stream to catch up, but we'll be started very shortly. And we still have a few people rolling into the call as well. And as usual, Jen, Christine, or Sarah, Tim, as I'm kind of doing my intro part here, if you could watch the room and just admit people as they come in, that's appreciated. All right, I am seeing the room slow down and we should be pretty close to caught up on the YouTube stream. So I think we will get into it. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to committee meeting number 7 of the CWD response plan review. I'm going to start off with the roll call like I have every other meeting, but just as a reminder, we will not have the full committee roster for this meeting today, as some members just couldn't fit this in their calendar. Attendance was not required for this meeting due to it being an added meeting to the schedule in the charter. But of course, the committee members that were not able to attend were encouraged to provide their email input to represent their stakeholders. And we did receive some emails from those members that we can have as input as well as the input we received today. So with that, like I say, I'm going to dive into the roll call. And again, knowing we're going to be missing some groups because a few have already let me know, but we'll start it off with the DNR staff. Eric Canania.
Good morning, Kurt. I'm here.
Excellent. Mandy Camps.
I'm here.
Tammy Ryan.
Good morning. I'm here.
Dan Storm.
He's just joining us now, Kurt.
Excellent. Jeff Pritzel.
Good morning, everybody.
And then National Deer Association, I don't think they're able to join. I know Kip at least, but I'll try for Matt. Wisconsin Wildlife Federation, don't think Ralph can join us, but Justin.
Good morning.
Good morning. Wisconsin Bowhunters Association, Bill.
Yeah, this is Bill.
Excellent. Rick. Then Sporting Heritage Council, Elizabeth Baker. Wisconsin Greenfire, Mike Samuel.
I'm here.
Excellent. And I know Mike Foy joined us, but I think he had to jump on another call for a second, but he is with us. Conservation Congress, I know Mike Riggle was not able to make it today. Joel. Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, Noah. Jeffrey. And then Wisconsin County Solid Waste Management Association. I don't think Dave nor Amanda are available today, but Dave and Amanda. All right, Whitetails of Wisconsin. I know Ryan can't be available, but Lori.
Lori's here.
Excellent. Deer and Elk Farmers Association, Jerome.
Present.
Roxanne. And then moving on, Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission. I think they have a conflict today as well, but Travis and Miles. Moving on to Oneida Nation, Shad. Brittany. They may have had a similar conflict. Redcliffe, Andy.
Good morning.
Good morning, Chase. And then moving on to our technical support staff, Lindsay Long.
Here.
Thank you. Dave McFarland.
Good morning, everybody.
Bob Holzman.
Good morning, all.
Ben Beardmore.
Good morning.
Chris Goodwill. Pete Dunn. Natasha Gwitt.
Morning.
Good morning. Dan Kroll.
Good morning.
And then with our Department of Ag and Trade and Consumer Protection partners, Darlene. Amy.
Good morning.
Good morning. Wildlife Services, Dan Herchard. WVDL, Dan Barr. And finally, Department of Health Services, Lorna. All right, that wraps up our roll call. So thank you everyone for going through that process one more time with us. Just a few more meeting logistics. As with all previous meetings, the meeting is being recorded and streamed via the DNR YouTube channel. So thank you to all that are watching currently or watching as a recording. Also on our Zoom call here, committee members will notice that we have a larger roster of DNR staff that are on the call. We did invite both the CWD implementation team and the wildlife leadership team to be on this call. These teams will be involved in the next step of the review process. We wanted them to be able to be on the last meeting to get a feel of the committee process as we transition. Obviously, we'll have all meeting minutes, recordings, and documents as well to help them transition and get all the information. CWD implementation team actually did meet last week as an introductory meeting to their part in the review process. This committee's input document was shown to them, and that document did lead the discussion and will continue to be a focal part in their future meetings. Obviously, the final version of the input document will be shared with the team before their first working meeting. And that is the main reason we are here today, to get to that final input document. So today's meeting will be similar to the last with a focus on committee discussion. Jen and Tom will lead off a few slides on the input document, as well as the model and additional plans. And then after that, we'll go into the basically committee discussion to get input and work through finalizing on the portions of the input document. And as we said at every meeting, please allow all members the opportunity to speak. And as a reminder to the folks, there is the raise hand function in Zoom. So if you're having trouble kind of finding an opportunity in the conversation, that's a good way to be known that you'd want to speak on a subject, and we'll keep an eye on the participant list for that. We're also going to use the roll call technique, I guess you can say, to go through and make sure we get comments from every stakeholder group. And finally, I want to say this, I know it fits better at the end of the meeting, but I'd like to be sure it gets said and doesn't get rushed. Like sometimes our meetings, they go right to the end. Just want to say thank you to all the members for all the work that we've had through this process. This has been a large effort, and everyone has devoted a great amount of your own time to provide input on this review and work through a new process for pretty much everyone. You've all stuck through all the pre-work, the meetings, even the increased meetings, and this input document is a result of all that hard work. And really, I think it is an impressive document when you just look at all the things that are within it. Of course, as we talked about last meeting, may not be the 100% perfect document from everyone's perspective. And again, as we talked about last meeting, it won't solve CWD in one fell swoop, but it should be hitting the major objectives for each group and will help with the future of the response plan and CWD management moving forward. So I think it's just important to take a step back and just kind of see the impactful step that we all work together to accomplish. And I think something cool to think about. But with that, like I say, that's more of an end of the meeting thing. We can move on to having one more productive meeting and get towards that final document. And I can turn it over to Jen and Tom, unless there are any questions before we get started. All right, with that, I think Jen, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Kurt. Let me go ahead and share my screen first. And I'll echo what Kurt said. Thanks, everybody. I know this has been a lot of work, a lot of pre-work, a lot of like heavy thinking, and many meetings. So we really appreciate all your efforts here. I hope that as the input document has been revised, you can really see how much value is coming out of it and how all that work is not only useful for the review, but is also provides a great framework for the DNR to make additional decisions, for example, as they're implementing parts of the plan. I think all of this work is still valid, and this decision tool is going to additionally continue to provide a lot of value to the DNR, to CWD response. So we'll go ahead and dig in. Kurt, let me just confirm that you can see my slides.
Yep, all looking good.
All right, here we are, meeting 7, conclusions. That's pretty exciting. This is just, I'm going to go through a few things more broadly, just because we do have additional people on the call today. So this is what we've done. These are the meetings that we've gone through as a group. Here we are in meeting 7. This is our wrap up. We've sent around a revised input document with the consequences table with some prevalence tables that summarize the model output and how various alternative plans and strategies affect the objectives that were defined by this committee. So we have this input document that is going to be further revised after this meeting with conclusions based on the discussion today. And that's going to be provided to the CWD implementation team to inform the second 5-year review of the CWD plan. But again, all of this information is still going to be used going forward. And I think the insights here today are going to have a long-lasting impact on CWD response in the state. So I think that's really exciting. And here was our diagram that we've used, where we are integrating this structured decision-making approach with the systems approach, where we defined our goal statement early on and the objectives of the committee being what the committee really cares about. What are the values that are important relative to CWD response? And with the aim of being inclusive here of all objectives. Then we developed alternative packages. So these are our alternative plans that contain a suite of response activities within each one and are aimed at reducing CWD, but also balancing other stakeholder objectives. We've worked with Tom Fitteman from Ventana Systems, and he's really helped us to model what will happen underneath of those plans and predict how various alternative plans, alternative strategies can help us better achieve our CWD objectives. So this is where we have been right now, and we're going to look at some of the trade-offs today within the table, because that consequences table, again, provides us a nice layout to see how various plans may improve performance on some objectives relative to what we're doing now. However, it may also result in additional costs or some negative impacts as well. And all of this is being passed off to the CWD implementation team. And we spent a lot of time talking about plans, and those are actions that are within legal DNR authority. But today we'll also spend a little bit of time talking about some of those additional scenarios that were put forward by the committee that are not within DNR authority, but that the model can begin to help us gain some insights about, for example. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that. So here are our goals for today. We're going to review and discuss the results. We're going to look at first those alternative plans, these things that are within the DNR legal authority to implement. And then we'll also look at those additional scenarios. We'll have some time for discussion on these points. And then we'll move on. We're going to spend the second half of the meeting to basically have some open discussion. What are the key insights, the final conclusions? What does the committee want to make sure that the DNR hears or considers when completing the review process? And again, we have a lot of folks here from the DNR specifically to listen in today on what y'all have to say. So I'm going to go ahead, get out of my slides, and start with our consequences table. And so this is the consequences table that was provided in the input document. And hopefully you can see it okay. I know this is going to be a little bit challenging, but it's the same input same consequences table that's in the document. I think there may have been one correction that we made, but overall it's the same. So in column A, these are the core objectives. These are the things that the committee cares about. And so for the top two, for example, we have minimized impacts of CWD on wild deer and elk. And the second one is maximize non-DNR participation in CWD response efforts. And there are more below. Then we have sub-objectives. These are sub-objectives related to each of those core objectives. I won't go through them all either, but for minimizing impacts of CWD on wild deer and elk, we have minimizing prevalence rates, minimizing distribution of CWD in wild deer, minimizing the risk of CWD transmission to elk, and minimizing prions in the environment from infected deer carcasses. This committee then defined metrics that are relevant for each one of those sub-objectives. So these are the performance metrics that we can use to evaluate how well various management or response strategies will influence that metric. Within the input table, we also included a column or a table that has the method for predicting values. And so this is us trying to transparently tell you where the source of these predictions came from. And we have quite a few that are model derived. So these are the ones that Ventana and Tom have helped us to predict. And that includes like prevalence and distribution here. Some of them we used Wisconsin's Human Dimension Survey results for some of these, specifically for the number of deer that hunters will harvest. And others we used expert judgment, and we'll be the first to acknowledge that this is a tool. This is something that's supposed to be helpful to inform the decision, but we know it's not perfect. We could work on this for 10 years and it still wouldn't be perfect. I think the important thing is it helpful? Have we done the best that we can to capture these predictions within the time frame that we have? And then also to be honest and transparent about where there are uncertainties. And so some, for example, I will highlight as some of the costs are the impacts of CWD response on industries such as the solid waste and wastewater industries. I think are areas where there's a lot of uncertainty. There are a lot of specific details about response that may affect those industries, but maybe we were not able to really capture here within this committee process. So I think today we'll have time to have some responses, some reactions, if there are areas that the committee think there need to be refinements or that these predictions are not matching what you think, especially in those expert judgment categories. We have time for discussion about that. So for the consequences table, since it is so hard for everybody to see, I'm going to provide a couple key highlights, but then we're going to bounce over to the prevalence table, which shows the predicted prevalence rates in each one of our geographic areas, endemic area, leading edge, and new foci. I think that'll help lead some of our discussion today. We lose a little bit of the detail in this consequences table on prevalence and spatial distribution because we're trying to summarize the statewide predictions. And so those prevalence tables allow us to look at those geographic areas individually. So let me just bring up some notes. All right, so with this consequences table, for these other columns here, I'm going to hide a couple things just to make it a little bit easier for everybody to see. And Kurt, you can tell me if this is working or not. All right,
Yep.
so
It's
I've
looking
got,
good.
all right, so hopefully this will help. I'm just putting our sub-objectives here. And then the rest of the columns are our different alternative plans. And so I'm not going to go through all those plans again, but they vary based on several dimensions. One being allocation of resources across those three geographic areas. The other one being who can implement who's going to implement or lead the response activities and specifically deer reductions, whether that's going to be voluntary hunter effort or it's going to be some kind of DNR-led effort, which would include incentivizing hunters in some way or targeted removals. All right, so we have a do nothing alternative. This represents a scenario in which the DNR doesn't do anything anymore. It stopped spending any resources or dollars on CWD response. We also have status quo. So this is represented or represents the current plan as it's implemented now. So not as it's written, but as it's currently implemented. And then we have these additional 8 plans that again vary based on who's doing the work, the geographic distribution of resources, and then also age and sex class of deer that are targeted for removal. So for example, bucks, mature bucks, all deer, or does. So some of the take are, first of all, the scale here is everything is relative to status quo. So for status quo, the predicted value is always going to be a 0. And then positive values indicate better performance for that objective relative to status quo, and then negatives are the reverse. So that's, we're doing worse than we would, than we expect the outcomes in the year 2040 to be worse than they would be under the status quo. So as expected under do nothing, we see a lot of negatives. And then under these 8 plans, we see some positives. So backing up just to give you a better view of the entire table. One thing I want to point out right away is we don't have any plans that give us greens down the entire row, or even all greens and zeros. What does that mean? That means that there are trade-offs, and that while we may do better under some of these proposed plans, for example, Plan 4 has some improvements on prevalence rates and also that expected spatial distribution. It does also have some pretty nice, some dark yellows here, which indicates in this case, this row indicates social or like public acceptance. And in other words, this plan may improve or reduce CWD spread and prevalence, but it also is going to be met with a lot more resistance to implementation. So it's uncertain whether or not this plan would actually go through. And that's because it contains some really controversial policies. For example, targeted removal by DNR. All of these plans 1 through 8 also represent an increase in resources relative to the status quo. And this is a coarse measure, but we estimated that the resources required to implement these plans may be 2 to 3 times the resources that are currently available. So this also tells me the DNR may be doing pretty well right now, given what it has. Right now, DNR's current response activities are limited by the resources that are available for response and are also constrained by public and social and political pressures. So while I think status quo, maybe some reallocation of effort to new foci, for example, may help move the needle a little bit on CWD response, I think that really what we're seeing here is that it's going to take some controversial policies and increased resources to really see appreciable change. Before I open it up for discussion, I'll go through this prevalence table as well. Can you see this one okay, Kurt?
Yeah, you can, a few more clicks.
Yep.
That would be good. Yeah.
Perfect. This is the same table that's in the input document, but I also added this column H, which is the expected level of resistance to implementation, where the status quo has low resistance to implementation because it's already being implemented, but any of the other plans either have some level of an increase in the likely level of resistance to implementation because of those controversial policies. So in this table, we have our alternative response plans over on the left, our do nothing status quo. These were the initial plans that we developed just to get a sense of what the DNR could achieve. And they represent some increase in resources, but those resources are specifically allocated to one of our 3 geographic areas. And then we also have looked at hunter versus department driven response. And then down here, we have our plans 1 through 8 again. So these first columns, B through D, are the predicted prevalence rates in 2040. And so these are the model-derived prevalence rates that we received from Tom's model. And then up here, E through G are our objectives that we're getting from the model, which is minimizing prevalence, which we calculated or took an average of the predicted prevalence rates in the endemic area and leading edge. and then minimizing spatial distribution. This is a key limitation because the model is not spatially explicit. So what we did is we took the average of the prevalence rates in the leading edge and new foci, and then we use that as a proxy, expecting that, and the assumption there is that if prevalence rates in those two areas are increased or are higher, then that's likely also correlated to an increase in spread. This is not a perfect proxy. I think there's a lot of room here to discuss how that could be improved upon, but it's what we have for now. Next column, we have the relative resources again, where status quo is not applicable, and then everything else is relative to status quo. So we have $1 sign indicating 1 to 2 times the resources required for status quo, and then plans 1 through 8 are 2 to 3 times the resources within status quo. All right, so highlighting a few things. First, let's look at our do nothing versus status quo here. As you can see, in the endemic area, leading edge and new foci, we do see some reduction in prevalence rate with what the DNR is currently doing. And we would expect that, right? But looking down the line, implementing these new plans, we do see some changes or some improvements relative to status quo, but I don't think we're moving the needle that much, for example, in the endemic area. Under plans 1 through 8, we know the lowest that we go is from a 0.45 prevalence rate to a 0.39. So what does that say? That's saying that with the resources we have available, with these plan options, we're not really able to move the needle in an appreciable way within the status quo. The leading edge, we have a little bit better story here, where we do see some reductions in prevalence rates. And specifically, the one that performs best is Plan 4, where I think it's 60% of resources are allocated to response efforts in the leading edge. And so that does produce some appreciable changes in expected prevalence rates. Similarly, with new foci, we do see the needle moving here as well. And Plan 7 in particular, which allocated 80% of response resources, resulted in a 0.09 prevalence rate instead of 0.44. So again, seeing some ways to move the needle, but it does require some big reallocations of resources, an increase in resources relative to the status quo, and also implementation of some controversial policies. All right, I know it's a lot of information, so I first just want to open it up and see if anybody has any questions so far. And Tom and Kurt, you're up, and Christine also, if there's something else you wanted to point out that I missed, feel free to add to what I've said.
I think the only thing to add, you covered it well, is this doesn't show the full picture, of course, and then there's more to a consequences table than just prevalence. But I think it's a good way to kind of take the first step in looking at all the information that is in front of us, and can kind of help focus some conversation. So yeah, be interested to hear if there's any comments. And we have a hand raised from Andy.
Go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, good morning. Could you just clarify for everybody what prevalence rate actually reflects? Is it a percentage? So is 0.52 prevalence rate actually 0.52%, or is that 52%?
Oh yeah, good point of clarification. That would be 52%.
Thank you. That's what I believed. I just wanted to make sure, and I didn't have the actual plan open in front of me at the moment.
Yeah. Looks like Mike Samuel has his hand raised.
Yeah, so I have 3 questions that I'm perplexed by. The first is related to the prevalence. Is this prevalence in the deer population? What does 52% represent specifically?
Yeah, that's correct. 52% of the deer population. And Tom, I'll let you jump in if you have anything else to add to.
Right. So that's actual modeled prevalence in the population. So it differs a little bit from fraction positive that you'd get from your surveillance just due to the age and sex composition of the deer that you're taking.
And where does that come from, Tom? I mean, I know it's model driven, but I mean, does this match reality?
It matches reality in some of the surveillance areas. We haven't done a lot of kind of cross-sectional calibration of the model against different areas in Wisconsin, but it's certainly within the variation that we see. I guess if I were to say whether this, how representative it is, I'd say if anything, it's on the pessimistic side. But also in part, there's a bias here from the information that you're seeing. So if you look at the new foci column, that's a representative sort of recently infected township, which could be somewhere up north, for example, but it's not the entire currently uninfected state. So this would be the fate of a township that gets infected in 2020 and detected next year or something. It would not be the fate of the entire uninfected portion of the state right now.
So my concern here is that when we discussed prevalence and infection rates a while ago, it became quite obvious that this is a key parameter in the model. And I've been looking at the 11 monitoring areas that the DNR has, and I just sent copies of some of the data to Kurt and Jennifer. And the male prevalence data indicates that the males plateau out at about 51% in 6 of those areas, which likely means that the population prevalence is at least 15 points below what you're showing here, which suggests to me that many of your other parts of this table are considerably higher than they really are going to be. Impact on what works and what doesn't work. If you, for example, took 15% off of all the data in those columns, many of those would be quite viable solutions. So I think this is really key, that this model represents what's really happening in Wisconsin. It's key to us making decisions about it. The second area of concern is that I was never clear, and I hope maybe the rest of the committee is, I was never clear how, when we looked at a plan, how allocating 100% amongst 3 different categories played into the results. Based on sort of looking at some of the plans, it appears that, for example, if you allocated in Plan 4, if we allocated even more of the resources to leading edge, it would have even more of an impact. So I guess one of the things I would ask is, are we looking for areas where we can have real solutions? Or are we just looking for just spreading resources out across in a way that really doesn't make a big difference? And my third question is, we've shown all these pluses and minuses for all these solutions, but nothing here represents what happens to the deer population as a result of any of these plans. And so that seems to me to be a critical part of our evaluation, is not only the resources that are required and prevalence, but what happens to the population of deer? Do we see dramatic declines in deer population, or is it not a big deal? What's really going to happen in the long run if we continue to let CWD sort of run rampant across the state?
There's a lot to dig into there, so we'll try to work through them, and feel free to jump in. Anybody else if we're missing one of the questions?
Well, can you please show the slides that I've sent you? Because I think that's critical for the people, other people to see what's going on in the state and how it relates to the values that are in this table.
If you just sent it, I haven't read my email yet this morning or seen it.
I just sent it about 10 minutes ago. It's a PDF. There's like 4 pages. It would go very quickly for you to show it.
Okay, well, let's save it for the discussion part. I think this is important and I want to give you the floor to be able to show that, but I still want to go through and have everybody be able to ask some questions first before we get into the discussion part.
Is there an answer on why the deer population estimates aren't here as well? And is there an answer on what exactly the implications of allocating your 100% resources in different areas?
Yep,
affects
absolutely.
the results?
So the deer population, it's something that was discussed when we talked about objectives, but it didn't end up being captured in any of the objectives of the committee. And maybe that's something that, again, this is why we always iterate with this process, because that may be something that is important and simply didn't make it into the committee's list of objectives. However, the model does have predicted impacts to the deer population. So that's absolutely something that can be incorporated into these tables with prevalence, for example. And as far as the budget allocation, that's to give us, that was to give us some kind of idea of what could be expected under relative budgets. We could come up with effective solutions to CWD, and Tom has actually run some scenarios that do that. But if they aren't feasible for the DNR to implement under current resources, I think that's really important to know. That way, there can be some decisions. For example, then there is justification for why resources need to be increased if responding to CWD and really moving that needle is the desire.
Sorry, I'm not sure my question was very clear, Jen. On Plan 4, for example, on leading edge,
Sure.
instead of, I can't remember what the allocation of that relative to leading edge is relative to endemic and new foci, but how would it affect the results if 90% of the effort went into leading edge and 5% into the other two? Would we get to a result on leading edge that's actually, something that benefit?
Yeah, we could certainly run that. Plan 4, the allocation is 10% endemic area, 60% leading edge, and 30% new foci. So I think if we increase from 60% in the leading edge, then we will see improvements on expected prevalence rates there. So it would drop lower. And then for new foci, we may see increases in those prevalence rates.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. There are infinite number of combinations that are out there, and these plans were what we started with based on the committee discussion and where we could kind of have starting points, but the process isn't ending today, and that kind of stuff can continue to be looked at, and numbers can be moved around to see what those impacts could be. And yeah, Plan 4 might show that maybe a 90% in leading edge is something significant, so something more to look into. So I think that is an important thing to keep remembering.
And I think I want to point, go ahead, Tom. No.
I was going to say, I think you have put your finger on an important point, which is that we don't have a spatial budget to inform the model. So we don't know the current allocations very well. It's not that couldn't be done. It's just that it couldn't be done within the time available. And so we know a lot more about the impact of putting in an additional dollar into one area versus another than we know about the effect of taking a dollar away or an hour of time away from one area and putting it into another.
Yeah, and another point that I think is really important here is, Mike Samuels is correct that there's a lot of uncertainty in these numbers. We're presenting one, but, maybe with the data he's going to provide, there is a reason to think that the prevalence rates themselves will be optimistic. However, what I would stress here is that I don't think that like reducing some of those uncertainties is going to change the relative performance of these plans. So even, when comparing plans, I think we're still getting a lot of value. We can still use this information that we have here. If we don't concentrate as much on the exact numbers, but the relative performance, we can begin to see which strategies are going to help us get where we want to go more effectively. All right, Mike, have we answered your questions for now? I think let's make him a co-host so he can share his slides when we get to the discussion part.
Just a couple other quick comments on Mike's questions. On prevalence, it's high here. And, for example, if you look at Sauk and Iowa County, they're currently at about 30% fraction positive rather than true prevalence. And they, at least to the eyeball, do look like the growth rate is slowing down or approaching saturation a little bit. So there are two possibilities. One is that the model's a little pessimistic compared to these areas. I think that kind of improves the prospects for the state overall, but it probably doesn't kind of reshuffle the relative effectiveness of different policies very much. But the other thing that the model does, at least in scenarios where there's significant environmental prion effects, is that in the endemic area, as you kind of approach saturation, growth slows, but it doesn't go to zero the way it does in a typical epidemic model, because you've still got the prion accumulation process in the environment running. So growth kind of levels off at a few percent a year and prevalence continues to increase long term, which is how you get to these numbers like 50%. So if the kind of the environmental vicious cycle is less important, then in particular that would modify this a little bit. But that's what makes the endemic area so resistant to policy interventions. That's why kind of column B on the spreadsheet here, the numbers don't move very much.
So just to respond to that, Tom, when people come get the chance to look at the data, I think you'll see it's pretty clear that the pattern is that these are leveling off. Now, whether that means that the environmental component is much less than we hypothesize, or whether it means that the environmental component is yet to come, I think isn't perhaps an open question, but it seems to me we ought to go more by what the data tells us than what we had hypothesized.
The other thing it may mean is that, it may have some implications for what's the right level of density dependence, and also for how important are the dilution effects from recruitment of young, healthy deer, at least initially healthy. And actually the model does generate population and the health population by health status and so forth. We have a full consequence table out of the model that has, a dozen variables and 75 runs in it that we didn't share, but it's essentially, this is it. It's kind of an overwhelming amount of information, but it is available. And certainly there are population effects and to some extent uncertainty about how much sort of fertility rebound you get if density falls due to either deliberate density reduction from, say, antlerless hunting or from CWD mortality, has some effect on how high the prevalence gets as well.
I think we have some other raised hands.
Yeah, Jerome, I saw your hand was raised.
Yes, to Mike's question regarding the population. The last year, the CDACs have specified for all the counties either increase, maintain, or decrease deer population. Were those taken into the model as a consideration in the focused areas for reduction of CWD? Or is that an area that we can learn from in those predictives of increase, maintain, or decrease from the CDACs that we won't make those decisions for another 3 years? And if it does make an impact, could they be changed to help the model in reduction of CWD on the landscape? Thank you.
We did not specifically take those into account in the model, partly because some of the expert sessions we conducted early on when we were building it, one of the issues that came up is that a lot of the CDACs have modified their goals to reflect reality on the ground, so that, you know, even if they wanted to reduce density, they didn't feel like they could reduce density because issuing more tags wouldn't attract more hunters, for example. So they just felt like they didn't have the tools to meet the goal. So why set a goal that was just going to go unmet year after year? And certainly if you look at the deer populations across most of the counties, there's a slow rise in populations, which is probably consistent with the slow decline in harvest that you see across the same area. So the model does reflect that. The base case has a slow decline in harvest effort and a slow increase in population as a result. But that's not, we haven't gone through and kind of systematically calibrated one by one to each county or to different representative townships or surveillance areas across the state. We'd love to have the resources to do that, but we didn't have time to do it this fall.
And I think another factor to put in there, and I think it kind of comes along with what Tom said, but the human dimensions research that we've had in previous meetings, as far as just that limit to move that needle, kind of no matter where the tags or the goal of a DMU is set. So there's other factors that play there too. Unless you had something, Jen, I saw Justin was raising his hand, but.
Go for it, Justin.
To me, I think everything screams the deer density is kind of the key driver of this model. And part of it though too is the other component of it is a lot of the reaction is driven by lowering the deer population. And I think there's two components that go into that deer density component of it. And one is the overall population, but the other is how do they utilize that habitat? And I think so in some cases, everybody goes to the natural place of let's lower the deer population, but nobody goes to look at it. Well, why don't we spread those deer out? And I think that has the component to have a bigger plan on it, because deer naturally congregate around food sources. So the winter time is where you're going to have those large components. And I think sometimes fighting where the public is naturally going already today puts us in a worse shape. And I think it shows why in a lot of cases we've beaten our head against the wall for too many times, where everybody's told, well, you got to keep lowering these deer populations. In reality, no, what you want to do is you want to have more of these properties holding the deer off there, so they're not all heading to the same wintering ground and become concentrated in general. So I think there's a component there too where you can get better buy-in from the user groups, and it would completely flip if they realized that the only way to lower deer density wasn't necessarily to reduce population. I think that might actually flip your model upside down.
We do have some scenarios that Tom's going to present, specifically talking about contact rates. I think we can circle back on that discussion.
Right. I think
Tom?
what that would look like in the model is a reduction in contact rates that drive transmission without a corresponding reduction in population. And the model sort of isn't detailed enough to look at different patches on the landscape and actually model congregation at the individual level. But I think what you said is certainly consistent with something that would work in the model if we were to plug in proxy for that.
Tom, I think I'm going to stop share if you want to take over. Tom has some additional slides he's going to present, again, talking a little bit about the model, about the limitations, again, trying to be transparent about what we know, what we don't know, how it affects the decision, and then these additional scenarios. And so this will be kind of a back and forth and open discussion. Go ahead, Tom.
Okay, I just wanted to give kind of a quick recap without revisiting every single scenario we've generated, because it's a lot of information and there's a lot to talk about. So I was just going to give kind of a quick review of the work, talk about a couple of new scenarios that are interesting that came up when we started looking at the additional scenarios that people suggested, and then summarize some of the insights that are robust across various kind of iterations of the modeling work, things that keep coming up. So the model is meant to be not so much a kind of an answer generating machine, but a thinking tool that makes it easier to keep a whole bunch of conflicting effects in your head at once. So the model basically quantifies the state of the deer CWD system. How many deer are there at various ages, sexes, infection states? How many environmental prions are out there? What's sort of the state of mind of people responding to this based on the number of positive tests or whether positive tests have been detected in an area and so on. And then represents the policies that change these things. So the deer population is influenced by births and mortality from CWD and mortality from other causes. And we have a representation of kind of the chain of progression of CWD from initial exposure to clinical sickness and so on. So this helps by allowing you to do quick experiments, compare the model with data, let you generate outputs on a bunch of different metrics that might be of interest to different stakeholders in an internally consistent way. And it lets you try multiple policies together so you can see if they interact is greater or less than the individual parts. And it also captures trade-offs over time. So the model is dynamic. We start in 2000, we run over a historic period to the present, and then through into 2050. And of course, the further out into the future you get, the more uncertain the results are because of various things we don't know about the system, essentially. So the process is a set. We have kind of the central artifact, which is the model. We're feeding that model assumptions about how CWD works and about how deer fertility and mortality work, and how environmental prions work, for example, how many carcasses and what's the lifetime of prions in the environment. All these sorts of things go in as assumptions about the changes in the system. And then we also feed it decisions, or at least proxies for decisions. How many deer are you harvesting? How much surveillance are you doing? How many carcasses are you collecting, and so forth. And from that, we generate outcomes on the metrics of interest, prevalence, population, harvest. How hard is it to do all this? How much hunting effort does it take? How much human exposure is there to prions? And we also can then take the model outcome and compare it to data and see how we're doing and use that as a way to refine the assumptions. Or we may just look at the outcomes that people are saying and seeing and kind of look at the face validity of those and reconsider the structure of the model. But there's a lot of uncertainty in this system. In part, it's because prions aren't easily observable, so we don't know a lot about the direct versus the indirect infection pathway. We don't know a lot about the sources and fate of prions in the environment. There are lots of aspects of deer behavior that are not well known, and so on. Then, of course, there are also some uncertainties on the human side. For example, if you went in and do sharpshooting, what does that do to hunter activity? Or more generally, what is it that hunters are looking for in the experience that would influence their future effort to harvest deer? Some of the policies you can implement, we know there is an effect, and there's sort of a good mechanistic argument for how they work. Things like a baiting and feeding ban, reducing deer congregation, but the effect size is not well known. There aren't kind of randomized controlled trials that tell you that if you ban baiting and feeding, it will reduce contact among deer by precisely 13%. We just don't know. There are also some policies that we can't represent, in particular, the kind of speculative technological policy like changing genetics or vaccination against prions. And not all experiments that we can do in the model can be done in reality. So in particular, the hunting policies, it's easy to increase effort in the model, but it may be hard to increase efforts in the real world. Actually, I think we can push this a step further in the future by modeling more of the incentives that influence hunters to choose a particular geography or to participate or not. But at present, we're certainly limited by that. Another key limitation at present is that we don't have explicit geography. So in the real world, the endemic area is contributing infections to the leading edge, and also by kind of long distance transportation to new areas. The real world has some interactions between the zones and also between wild areas and captive farms, which are not in the model. And we just don't capture those, but that does modify how some of these policies look. In particular, it probably makes the endemic area more important as a donor of dispersing infected bucks or infected carcasses getting transported to other geographies. So lots of important limitations that mean that essentially what you're doing with the model is informative about the dynamics, but it's not the final answer. Okay, I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about a couple of additional experiments that we've just run. Just briefly, any questions on kind of the general modeling approach or other things I've just said? Okay. So there's a part of the transmittal document to the implementation team will be some additional scenarios that have been suggested. And we can't model all of these things, or some of these have already been kind of covered as, or can be regarded as kind of covered by proxy of other experiments. But for example, we don't have the farm industry in the model, so we can't look at number 3. But there are a couple that are of interest. So one was questions about what is the uncertainty in prion half-life and other aspects of prions due to transmission, and in particular, what do policies for removal of deer carcasses from roadways do? So we took a quick look at that, and it reveals, I think, a couple of interesting things. And I see Jerome's hand is up. Do you have a question?
Yes, Tom. Can you just briefly explain item 9, the differences of response between the southern farmland and northern forest?
Sure. So I'll cover that in a moment. But the framing for that, as I understood it, was that there are regional differences in transmission due to differing deer density and amount of predation and kind of deer dynamics around fertility and recruitment. And in particular, the northern forests look different from the kind of the southern endemic areas, and that might affect response effectiveness. So we put together a quick scenario about that, and I'll show it to you in a moment. Does that help? Okay. So here's the kind of the setup for an experiment with uncertainty in the dynamics of prions. So actually, I'm just going to skip around for a moment to show you the structure here. So the key pieces are in these orange links here, which say that infected deer depositing prions in the environment, they degrade over some unknown lifetime, and they contribute to infections. And the share of infections that are from direct social contact versus indirect contact with these environmental prions is not well known. And then further, it's not just infected deer depositing prions in the landscape. It's also deer who die either from CWD or other causes who are infected, whose carcasses, if they remain on the landscape, also deposit prions. And so again, the balance of carcass deposition to live deer deposition is not well known. And, there are reasons to think that certain parts of a carcass are kind of much more dangerous than the deer as a whole. But on the other hand, there might also be reasons to think that the exposure to those prions is much less, particularly if the deer is, say, in a roadside ditch, as opposed to prions deposited at a deer yard or some other kind of feeding station congregation area. So on this slide, you see 4 curves. The blue line is the status quo scenario in the leading edge area, which I picked as a starting point just because it's kind of the most sensitive to interventions. The red is essentially same thing, but with a longer prion lifetime. but I made some adjustments in order to essentially preserve the same behavior over the historic period. So on the kind of the left half of the graph, I was trying to match the dynamics. So there's a constraint here which says that if one pathway is stronger than to observe the same growth rate in the data that we see, some other pathway has to be weaker. So in the red line, for example, prion lifetime is long, then either some combination of direct and indirect transmission rates has to be lower to compensate for that in order to get the same growth rate. Same thing, the green line is a higher carcass contribution, but if that's true, if the carcass contribution to prion deposition is higher, then something else has to be lower. Either the indirect transmission itself has to be lower, or the non-carcass deposition has to be lower. And then finally, the gray line here is lower contribution of environmental prions overall. So the indirect pathway is less important, and it's really only direct social contact among deer that matters. So this kind of shows the reason we don't know much about these things is that if you look at history, you can't really tell these apart very well, but they actually have some
Looks like we may have had an issue with Tom. Hopefully his internet catches back up here in a second.
and amplifies natural transmission. Whereas in the low indirect scenario, that's not very important. This is just one of the unresolvable puzzles without getting more information about the system, is that we have a bunch of similar histories that have somewhat different future outcomes. And they also have different implications for the effectiveness of policies. So I looked at a hypothetical roadway collection scenario. We don't have explicit road mortality in the model, but if you look at deer kind of non-CWD, non-harvest mortality in the model, it's about 10% of the population per year. And about half of that might be road mortality. At least I think I've seen 6% per year, or 6% of the population per year killed on roadways as an estimate. So that's the data point that we use to set this up. In a population of a couple thousand deer, that means maybe 100 deer a year are killed on the roads. So we looked at what happens if you collect all of those carcasses and dispose of them in some way that takes those prions out of circulation. And so each pair here is a different scenario with and without that roadway collection. And the interesting thing here is, in spite of the fact that in some of these carcasses are much more important than others, because of these compensating effects, that if carcasses are more important, something else has to be less important. The differences that you see from that roadway collection policy are not very big. So in all cases, there's a benefit to that policy, at least if you could implement it. But at least in a variety of scenarios, there's not a lot of uncertainty in the policy effect. There are probably a couple of combinations I didn't try here. So for
I think we lost Tom again.
Yeah, hopefully catches back up again while we're talking, but I might send him a message to see if there's something he can turn off on his, that's maybe pulling some bandwidth from him.
Yeah, Tom, you've been freezing a little bit. I could always share your slides if you'd like, if that would help your bandwidth issue.
You're muted right now as well, Tom.
Yeah, I actually got kicked out for a moment there. Sorry about that. I hope what I said was then halfway coherent.
Yeah, I think you're basically we lost you for probably the last minute or so of your wrap up of this part. And it appears it might be sharing that's slowing you down. So if it's I guess if it works for you, Jen or I.
Yeah,
could
why don't we
always
do
share.
that?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I can
You
do
want to
that.
go ahead, Jen? Perfect.
Hey, Tom, this is Dan. I have a question if it's all right. Oh, if you can hear me.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I suppose this is maybe obvious, but these different policy options, they don't necessarily work like additively with one another, right? Like if you did a bunch of other stuff that was having a positive effect or reducing prevalence, maybe like the roadkill thing might have a lesser effect, or does the magnitude of a effect could depend on what you're doing in other areas?
There actually are some interactions. Certainly in the model, everything is definitely happening at once. So at least if interactions can exist, they do exist in the model run. And actually there tend to be some kind of self-reinforcing effects. So for example, if you're reducing density with antlerless harvest and reducing contact with a baiting and feeding ban, then policies will have an even greater effect at the margin. And I think what's happening is that you're getting closer and closer to a threshold where, which is, the place you're trying to get is where the reproduction ratio for the disease is less than 1, meaning that an infected deer infects less than 1 additional deer over its lifespan. So they don't replace themselves. And that's, if you can cross that threshold, that's where you get eradication and the disease dies out. And actually the closer you get to that threshold, the bigger the differences from additional policies get as you're slowing the growth of the disease and then eventually causing it to decline. So as you start to stack up policies, essentially the effects, the combined effects get bigger and bigger as you get closer to that threshold.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's an interesting result, and maybe even opposite what I was intuiting, which was like, well, if you're already doing X, Y, and Z, doing this other one maybe will have a lesser effect than if you did that one by itself. But
right.
Yeah, you're saying it's different. So that anyway, yeah, thanks for the answer.
Which is, it's kind of optimistic, I guess. There are other cases where there are diminishing returns.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, I guess if you pick some particular class of deer, let's say you want to target the dispersing bucks with hunting, then after a while, they just get tougher to find. So that policy would kind of get tougher over time, and you'd have to be adaptive and kind of change your strategy after a couple of years to find some more favorable demographic, for example.
Sure. Thanks.
Yep.
Good.
Actually,
Tom, let me know when you want
go
to
ahead.
forward.
Yeah, let's talk about the north-south, and I'll kind of run through the insights quickly. So again, the setup here was the question of, are things different up north? And our starting point, again, because it's just the most kind of sensitive and interesting scenario, is the leading edge area. And we talked this through with Kurt and Dan Storm, and we just fairly quickly constructed a scenario that was more representative of conditions in the northern half of the state. So lower fawn recruitment, which you could view as a combination of somewhat lower fertility and fawn survival. The model is actually kind of agnostic about which that is. Less antlerless harvest, somewhat greater non-harvest mortality for yearling and adult deer, and then some speculative predation effects such that infected or clinically sick deer are more likely to be taken by predators than others, and therefore they have higher mortality rates. And then finally, a change to the availability of external food resources so that deer become a little bit more sensitive to kind of density effects on carrying capacity. So that if they overbrowse the understory, then their food supply is more limited. That's probably not very important in this scenario, but those were some of the things that we could quickly characterize in the model. There are also some things that were left out because we haven't represented them. So probably the big one is the volatility in all of these things. So for example, we don't have year-to-year weather variations in the model. So as a result of that, and maybe some other aspects of carrying capacity differences, I think this experiment doesn't fully explain north-south density differences. So the deer density is maybe 10 or 20% lower than it is in the southern tier, whereas in reality, we observe a much bigger difference, maybe 50%. So if you run that, you get a somewhat different growth trajectory. So the blue curve here is the kind of the standard leading edge status quo scenario, and the green curve is the northern version of that. So prevalence is lower and saturates at a lower level. So actually this may look more like what Mike has in mind in the data that he's looking at in some of the assessment areas. So growth is slower in the baseline. That would probably also mean that if an infection were introduced, it would be detected somewhat later, at least at the same level of surveillance. And then the interesting feature is that if you inject a policy change, and here I just tested a baiting and feeding ban that reduces contact among deer, it reduces congregation, so it reduces kind of direct social contact among deer, and also contact of deer with an environment, with the kind of concentration of environmental prions deposited around something like a feeding site. So the interesting thing is you see, if you look at the red curve versus the blue, you can see that contact reduction does indeed reduce prevalence, but it continues to grow. In the gray line, not only does it again, the policy case in the gray line again reduces prevalence, but it actually reduces it by more. And I think it's, again, what we were talking about a couple minutes ago, which is you're closer to this threshold of no growth. And so the incremental effect of the contact reduction is bigger, essentially because you're in an easier situation. So again, this might be a cause for optimism about the effectiveness of policies in the northern tier of the state, and maybe in places where, for whatever accident of geography or the environment, it appears to be easier in the base case to manage the problem. And I see Mike Samuels has his hand up.
There you go.
Yeah, sorry. It took me a while to get the button. So, Tom, even though the prevalence would be lower in the north, wouldn't we expect it to have a fairly similar impact on the population, given that the demographic parameters and the deer population are not as favorable as they are in the south?
Meaning CWD would have a similar effect on the population?
Yeah, in terms of population reduction, yes.
I guess I would. I unfortunately didn't plot that here, and I'm not sure I can pull it up quickly, but I'd be happy to share that. I can add a slide to the deck that gets distributed.
I mean, it seems to me that these things plateau at a balance between the transmission rates and the number of susceptibles that are still out there. And so it may be that the number of susceptibles are sort of it just seems to me that the demographic impacts may be similar or may even be higher in the north, even though prevalence is lower. So I guess the issue I'm trying to raise here is that prevalence is not always an perfect indicator of what's going on with the deer population.
Good point. And actually, now that I think about it, on the next slide, I included some of the table. So let's see, if you read across here, I have the infectious population and the healthy population. So actually the improvement in the healthy population is quite a bit bigger in the northern scenario. I guess I don't have total population here. But I can pull that up and include a chart in the deck after we get done here. I guess if you add, probably since clinical deer aren't very big, the total population at the endpoint here in the leading edge is about 1,500, and in the north, let's see, 1,500 and down from. Actually, it's almost it's up a little. Well, yeah. So the policy means that the population decline is not so great. So the final population is bigger, and the effect is bigger in the north as well. I guess I don't have the 2022 populations here, so we can't say whether the future impact of CWD is bigger or smaller. So I'll have to go back to the model and pull that up for you. It's an interesting question. And of course, it's also somewhat contingent on how density dependent you think transmission is. And I suppose there might be reasons to think that there are some differences between the north and south on that parameter as well, although we didn't explore that. Okay, well, maybe I should kind of run through just the last couple of slides here so we can move on to discussion.
Real quick, Tom, do you want to do that first, or I have those the couple slides on the hunter scenarios?
Oh, I'd say go ahead with the.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to jump in here. Some of these additional scenarios, I'll provide some insights that Tom and I put together specifically on changes to deer harvest. For example, increasing opportunities for harvest or extending deer gun season, earn a buck incentives, and then also payment for positives. And payment for positives or other incentive programs like this, they are represented within the plans, but specifically here, we're looking at how how these may lead to increases in harvest above that threshold of 1.8 that the Human Dimensions research indicated as the desired number of deer per hunter. And thus is like our threshold of what may be achievable as far as utilizing hunters for reducing deer populations. So let me go ahead and switch back over to my slides. All right. So yeah, like I said, we did get a lot of interest in looking at various harvest opportunities that were outside of the DNR scope, so outside of the DNR's legal authority. These are things that would require legislative change, such as extending the gun season to match with the rut or having special seasons prior to the gun season. And then also harvest incentives, earn a buck, and payment for positives. So first, starting with harvest opportunities, while these policies may increase hunting opportunity, the Human Dimensions research that we were presented with a couple of meetings ago showed that there's already this threshold of the number of deer that hunters are willing to harvest per year. And the hunters reported that an annual harvest of 1.6 deer with a desired number of 1.8. So largely the research here suggests that hunters do not want to harvest more than they consume. And so this is really like an ethical consideration. So because of that, within the scenarios that we considered, hunters are unlikely to harvest more deer. And therefore, a lot of the scenarios that considered these type of policies to increase harvest opportunities really didn't move the needle very much on CWD prevalence and spatial distribution. One area in which increasing harvest may be possible, as Tom was indicating, is in the northern forest, where there is still demand for tags that isn't being met. And then the next one are these harvest incentives. So again, here we go. All right, and then the next one, these harvest incentives. So earn a buck and payment for positives. Earn a buck incentives have been shown to increase antlerless harvest in Wisconsin. Some of the model simulations suggest that increasing antlerless harvest can contribute to an effective strategy to reduce prevalence and spread. However, the strategy is unlikely to be enough on its own. So again, coming back to that magic bullet or that silver bullet versus silver buckshot. A strategy like earn a buck would likely need to be combined with multiple other policies to achieve appreciable results in reducing prevalence and spread. As far as payments for positives, model scenarios suggested that if we did see increased rates in harvest of deer, particularly combined with increases in the proportion of CWD positive deer harvested, i.e. through targeted removals of 6 deer, these do have the greatest potential at influencing CWD prevalence and spread. And notably, the harvest rates required to affect change were much higher than current levels. So this is really important and had to be sustained over many years. So it's unknown further what the payment would need to be for these incentives to move the needle very much. Budgets are not in the model, but the payment amounts that would be required to incentivize hunters, especially in these low prevalence areas where prevalence rates are less than 5%, would likely be cost prohibitive, just because it would take a lot of effort to see that monetary benefit due to those low prevalence rates. Tom, is there anything else you wanted to add to those scenarios?
No, I think that captures it pretty well. I think that, you know, the payment question is particularly tricky just because we don't have the budget in the model. So that's certainly something that's on our list, is to expand the menu of explicit options for hunter incentives in the future.
Mm-hmm. All right, and
I see
then,
Mike's hands up.
Yeah, I see a hand from Mike.
okay, go ahead, Mike.
Could you clarify the, under the scenarios of increased hunter harvest opportunities, the gun season in the rut, does that mean that, assuming you're limiting hunters to 1.8 deer, does that mean you're shifting towards more bucks and less does, or exactly how did that get implemented? I mean, that's the idea of hunting during the rut, is the bucks are more vulnerable.
Yeah, you know, we kind of played with some of those scenarios early on, so I don't know, unless Tom has anything written down. I'd have to go back and, you know, we may have to rerun those scenarios to specifically look at that. But I think here mostly we're taking other scenarios and having some insights on the predicted impact.
It certainly seems like it would be, you know, you mentioned that it's an ethics thing about people only taking 1.8 deer.
Mm-hmm.
It would certainly be interesting to see some human dimensions work on exactly what motivates people to take more or less deer, and whether there's an educational or an opportunity to sort of modify those behaviors.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And additionally, what other alternatives we haven't considered could potentially move that needle and make people more likely to harvest more.
And the other point I guess I wanted to either argue for or make is that in some cases, the payment for positive program might be used mostly in the new foci where there would not be as many positives, so the cost may not be as prohibitive as you're considering.
Yeah, that's true. I think the concern, what we talked about amongst, you know, our small group here with Tom, Kurt, and myself was really, it could work, it could move the needle a little bit in the new foci, but yeah, I think there's some uncertainty with how much effort hunters would put towards, you know, increasing harvest under that program, or if it would be more opportunistic if an individual hunter did see a sick deer, for example. But yeah, I think it is an interesting place to consider a program like that in the new foci.
And I think there are a lot of things that work like that, where if you are in an area where you can have very tight geographic focus or sort of very tight deer demographic focus, because prevalence is low, there may be opportunities to do things like payments for positives or other kinds of targeting measures much more cheaply than if you were looking at the endemic area where you'd be, you know, paying for every third deer.
Mm-hmm.
I see Dan's hands up.
Yeah, so for the payment for positives, was that just like, how did you model that? That was the effect that was affecting the mortality on infected deer, like raising that relative to uninfected deer or something through spatial targeting, or what was that? How is that modeled?
That's a possible proxy for it. And I guess there might be two effects. One is an increase in total participation because people feel like they're compensated when they unluckily harvest a positive deer. But the other might be that people then are seeking out positive deer in some way. So we have proxies for both of those, but we didn't directly simulate the incentives of the program in the model.
Oh, okay. So just so I'm clear, so you did not run a model with the payment for positives scenario, or
right. We just looked at existing scenarios with more or less demographic harvest or infected deer focus as proxies for what that might do.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks.
I think we have one more hand up. Lori?
Yes, I'm opposed to the payment for positive. It'd be one thing if we could tell which animals are positive by looking at them, but we can't. So in my opinion, you could be removing the resistant animals, and Mother Nature can do a much better job. I know I gave the example of what they found in Wyoming, that the resistant animals are taking over. So this is a something that I would be opposed to.
Yeah, and we've certainly noted that these would be that payment for positive programs do result in a higher level of resistance to implementation. So I think they're, we expect that a lot of people would feel the same way. All right, Kurt, break time?
Yeah, I think this is a good time for a coffee relief break. So if we want to get back here, just a couple minutes, so 10:40, I guess. Maybe a little bit after 10:40, 10:42, give people a couple minutes, and then we'll get into the next section.
Yeah, I pulled up these slides from Mike, so we can certainly go through those when we get back.
Sounds good. Yeah, if there's no more slides from Tom or you, then we can just get into the open discussion.
Oh, you're right. I think he has a few more slides.
All right. I hope everyone's back from their break, or at least getting close to it. The timer is beeping at me. All right, so time to get rolling into the next part. And I think there's a few more slides for Tom to go through, and then we'll get into the discussion portion.
Yeah, I think this will be quick. I just wanted to summarize a couple of things that seem to come up fairly persistently across a wide variety of simulations for different areas, different parameterizations of the model, and so forth. So hopefully these are relatively robust conclusions in spite of the kind of the sea of uncertainty that we find ourselves in. So if you could go to the next. So the first is that status quo looks like growth, but if you look at across the various counties or townships in Wisconsin, there is a lot of variation around that growth path, and a lot of it is unexplained. So on the right side is data for fraction positive from some of the early positive counties, Dane, Iowa, Rock, and Sauk. And they, in spite of fairly similar early conditions, say before 2007, they have rather different fates today. And we haven't simulated all of the differences or captured all of the differences among these. Probably the model looks more like the more pessimistic cases here. So actually that's maybe an opportunity as well for learning something about is trying to understand better what the causes of this variation are. But in any case, there's no instance, at least on any large geography, of kind of natural stagnation or extinction of the disease. Next slide, please. So what that means is the problem is fundamentally hard. You have to reduce transmission by some means by 50 to 80% in order to stop or reverse growth. There's no single policy that does that. You need a portfolio of policies. So on this chart, there are a bunch of kind of individual sensitivity experiments with different possibilities, targeting increasing the harvest of older bucks or younger bucks or antlerless deer, or reducing contact from baiting and feeding or other kinds of things. They all contribute somewhat, but none of them is a silver bullet that solves the problem all by itself. However, if you do all of these things, it is possible to win in this case. So the flip side of that is, in a sense, it's fortunate that there are a number of different possible pathways by which one might intervene in the system. You can harvest infected deer to reduce their residence time in the system so they have less time to infect other deer. You can reduce their social contact with susceptible deer. You can reduce the deposition of prions on the landscape, either by reducing concentration or congregation around points of exposure, or by managing carcasses and transportation of deer and products and carcasses better. So there are lots of places to intervene in this system. Next. The effectiveness of what you do depends in part on the portfolio of policies that you do, but it also depends a lot on where you look for the answer, what's important to you. There are worse before better dynamics or better before worse dynamics, such that if you want to improve the situation in 2040, you may have to suffer some kind of apparent degradation of the situation at present. That's in a sense part of the resistance problem with some policies. But if you can convince people that things are going to get better, then you have maybe better acceptance of the short-term pain that you have to suffer in order to improve the situation in the long run. There's also a lot of variation across different metrics. Things that make prevalence better might make absolute deer populations smaller and therefore lower abundance. So people aren't going to see as many deer when they're hunting. Lots of trade-offs like that. And I think, the appropriate response is to just try and look at a broad set of metrics and again, appreciate the total outcome rather than getting too focused on any single outcome. Last one, I think. Finally, timing is really important. If you intervene early, you're more successful, partly just because the absolute number of infected deer that you have to deal with is lower because the exponential growth hasn't proceeded as far, but also because you haven't activated this environmental prion deposition vicious cycle, which kind of amplifies the transmission of the disease and makes it harder or more irreversible. So if you want to intervene early, surveillance is a key enabler, at least in areas where you haven't yet detected an infection. But of course, surveillance only matters if you follow it up with action. But this is potentially a big opportunity because at these low levels in the third scenario here, it is possible, at least in the model, to eradicate the disease or to hold it at extremely low levels, whereas in the endemic area, that's pretty tough. I think that's it. So I really appreciate the opportunity to go on this modeling journey with all of you. And I hope we have a lot more interactions and more to say and can refine this work in the future.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Tom. And I think, these slides are a good kind of summation. And I think one thing I'd add to it is, the insights themselves are interesting. I think to some of us, some are expected. But I think a cool part of this, both with your modeling efforts, the modeling efforts, and structured decision making, the consequences table, we're able to visually show these insights, and I think that has a different impact than maybe just talking about them and not having some data and visuals to kind of back it up. So this is a cool thing to kind of wrap this section up on, and then go into discussion on all this.
And I think that's a great point. And in the future, that's a big opportunity, is to kind of continue track these projections into the future, see how we're doing, and use the modeling process as a way to monitor and refine strategies. Because part of the problem is we don't know what's going on about a lot of the details of the transmission process. And we have some big opportunities to learn about that here by trying things and seeing how they work out, seeing how the policies work, and seeing whether the model correctly predicts that. We can refine our understanding.
Yeah, certainly. And thank you, Tom. Appreciate you presenting those summary slides and those new scenarios. So now we're going to transition and open it up for discussion. I know that we have some slides from Mike that I'll go ahead and bring up. And if Mike, you want to start us off by talking about these, I think that's a good place to start. Let me just share my screen. All right.
So, yeah, I thought it was useful to look at the monitoring areas that the DNR has established in southern Wisconsin. and what's happened with prevalence of chronic wasting disease in each of those areas considered separately. These are the 11 different areas that the DNR has established. Most of them, as you can see, are in sort of south central Wisconsin, the original core area G and A there, and then areas surrounding that. And then the one over in southeast Wisconsin is very likely part of an outbreak that originated in Illinois and spread north into Wisconsin. But the south west part is pretty much probably its own outbreak separately from the Illinois one. So if you could flip to the next slide, Jen. So this shows, so there are 6 of those monitoring areas, most of them in the south central part, that show pretty much that CWD prevalence is beginning to plateau or has plateaued. So these graphs on the top, the blue is males, the red in the middle is females, and the gray on the bottom is yearlings. They show the predicted values as stars colored by the different colors, and the observed prevalences as circles with the same colors. As you can tell, the observed prevalences vary quite a bit depending on sample size and those kind of things. And then so the stars are basically modeled or predicted prevalence and what's happening with the pattern. And as you can see in these and the ones that come below them, that these are pretty much reaching beginning to reach a stable point, where males are much higher than females, as we've known for quite some time, and females are also higher than yearlings. But you can see they're all increasing. And what you'll see in these 6 different areas is that they tend to increase at different rates. So here, for example, north central Iowa seems to, these are all 20 years. So north central Iowa seems to decrease at a somewhat slower rate than northwest Iowa does. And of course, I don't know that we have a good handle on why that is occurring. That would be very useful to know. But if you look at, well, all 6 of the outbreaks, you want to maybe show the next slide, Jen. There's a lot of commonality in these patterns. Again, as I said, males are always higher than females, which are always higher than yearlings. And they all show similar, and you can go ahead to the last slide as well. They all show similar predictions of where they are reaching an equilibrium prevalence. For males, that's about 50%. If you look at all of these 6 outbreaks combined. For females, it's in the neighborhood of 35 to 37% prevalence. And for yearlings, it's in the neighborhood of 25% prevalence. And that seems to be a fairly characteristic pattern of all these outbreaks. And they seem to have that similar connection. And so that's why, Tom, I'm very concerned about the prevalence that you were using in your models. And it looks to me, you'd have to average these prevalences out based on their weighted number or the weighted proportion of males, females, and yearlings in the mix, but something around the neighborhood of 37% or maybe a little lower might be what I would expect based on this data. So to me, well, I think your graphs about sort of the influence of environmental contamination shows that it could be increasing slowly, but these tend to show a pattern of leveling off. And if we had significant environmental accumulation going during a 20-year period, I would sort of expect prevalence to continue to elevate rather than sort of leveling off. But I could be convinced otherwise. So there are 5 more monitoring areas. Maybe you could go back to the first one, Jen. And all of those 5 actually have not, well, 2 of them, I believe I'm not sure which two off the top of my head, but I believe either Sauk and or Richland, two of them are approaching that, look like they're approaching that threshold now, or getting close to it. The areas, the sort of core area there in a G is not anywhere near reaching that, about that level of prevalence yet. And why is, I think, an open question. And the same also with K. So all the other areas are still below the prevalences thresholds that I just showed in the first 6. So I guess one of the questions for me here, if you want to go back to your green flavored table, is how to interpret what these mean. I think that the modeling approach is such a powerful tool that it shows probably good indications of the magnitude of change. But I think if we sort of accept the prevalences that are in this as a measure of success or not, I think we may be making a mistake unless the data or the prevalences that we're seeing is a much closer match to what's occurring here in southern Wisconsin. So I would really like to hear from the CWD implementation team people in the DNR, Tammy, Dave McFarland, Dan Storm, maybe Lindsay Long, how they're going to interpret this table in terms of what actions, how it's going to drive actions that the DNR is likely to take during the next 5 years and beyond. Are they looking at absolute magnitudes of prevalence, or are they looking at where are we going to get the most change? That's about all I have, Jen. Thanks.
Yeah, sure. And they may not have great answers for you yet because the implementation team hasn't dove deeply into this, but we have discussed additional scenarios, and model runs need to be revised to better reflect emerging data. Then that's absolutely something that I suspect we'll consider with the team.
This is Tammy. Yeah, I'll just weigh in too, and I agree with what Jen just said. And Mike, I think the questions that you're posing are definitely a good place to start. So we don't have those answers at this time, but certainly we have a lot to consider going forward.
Tom, were you going to say something?
I can.
It just looked like you had unmuted. I just wasn't sure if you had a comment.
Oh, must have just been tapping my pencil. But I think this is interesting. I think just to speculate a little bit, part of the difference may be spatial focus, that we've been looking at county-wide results where the growth that you observe is a combination of growth and prevalence in each sort of grid cell, plus increasing the spatial extent. So a county is kind of a heterogeneous mix of pieces that are at different stages of growth. And so when you add up all those curves, you don't see the saturation as soon. However, I think the more general observation that the saturation appears to be at a lower level in the data that Mike was showing there, I think bears further investigation to understand what might be different about the scenario. I guess I would tentatively conclude that the model is currently, at least the base case, is pessimistic by 5 or 10%, in which case all of these numbers look better. But the really interesting question is, does it change sort of the distribution of effectiveness across the areas or across the plans? And I think that's an unknown at the moment. that we should investigate further, provide better input if we can.
And I just wanted to add one thing, if I could, that it's this question about environmental contamination, I know is a contentious one. It's a one we have very little knowledge about. But one of the things that struck me was that if we have generalized environmental contamination, what I would expect, or I think a reasonable prediction, would be that the relative prevalence in males would go up compared to females, because males are consuming more, they have a bigger body size, they're also traversing much larger parts of the environment than females are. So there's sort of this generalized contamination that's occurring across the environment from carcasses and feces and urine and all those kind of things, and in plants. I would expect to see that more males become infected because of that. And if you look at I didn't show this, but if you look at the ratio of males to female infection rate, there's no strong evidence of any change in pattern. The data is fairly variable, but there's no indication that the pattern really varies from what we've seen in early parts of the outbreak, which is, a ratio of about 2 to 1. So I know that's not a sort of any proof that environmental contamination isn't important, but it's certainly something that ought to give us pause about including strong environmental contamination into our models at this point.
That's a really interesting thought. Interestingly, my mental model was kind of the opposite, which is that if it's dose, I guess it depends whether it's dose per body mass or absolute dose that matters. You could also view it as if bucks are roaming around and larger, that their prion exposure is more diluted by large body mass, and that they're not spending as much time in any one contaminated place. So I guess it would depend if there's a threshold exposure or not, or if simply kind of even at low levels, it remains pretty linear. But I guess absent the information, you want to pick policies that in some sense respond to the uncertainty by splitting the difference. So for example, you wouldn't want to ignore the environmental pathway and focus exclusively on hunting or baiting and feeding or something. But maybe the thing that really matters going forward is how do we learn more about this and explain some of this and some of the other unexplained variation between the counties that we see.
Okay, so I'm looking at time and I want to allow everybody to have an opportunity to speak. I see Jerome has his hand up. Jerome, is this about the current discussion or is this a new topic?
Current discussion.
Okay, yeah, if you want to go ahead and speak, and then after that, we're going to do roll call and let everybody have an opportunity to share their or any thoughts or bring up any topics for discussion.
Okay. The question for Mike, when you're looking in your Iowa County as general and then Northwest Iowa County, are the numbers different if you're north of the river versus south of the river? As one question. And the reasoning is I have a small research farm in that area, and we're seeing quite the opposite of survivability of the bucks in various age groups out 7 years. But at the same time, the does seem to be the ones that are more susceptible. And in that, it's just the question of we're running through our genetics to be able for that improvement. Just a comment.
I haven't looked at that, Jerome, to look at either side of the river off the top of my head. If you look at when CWD was detected, for example, or found in some of these areas, what it looks like is, of course, the further you're away from the original core area, the later it is that you're likely that CWD arrived. So that's going to have some influence on where those curves end up. But that's a good question. I can go back and look at that.
All right, Christine, you want to help us do a roll call?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks everyone to the comments you've provided so far. I'm just going to run through each of the primary committee members, and we'll ask that, if you have any thoughts on the results or some of the insights that Tom has presented, now is the time to provide your feedback. So I'm going to start off with Eric Canania in our DNR staff.
I just jumped back on from being away for a little bit, so I'm not familiar with the topics that were recently being discussed, but I have no issues on the response plan at this point right now.
All right, thank you, Eric. Next on my list then is Mandy Camps.
I think all this information is very insightful, and I've appreciated just listening to the other comments that have been coming in at this meeting and others as well, and all the extra work that's been done in between. I think that's given some thoughts, at least in my mind, as I'll be I'll be leading the efforts with our implementation team here, shifting gears a little bit to that team and looking forward to where we'll be going with all this input here. So I think at this point, I just would like to express this appreciation for all of the input and everything in our entire document, plus all this model work. I think it's just very insightful and will be extremely helpful as we continue on in the process.
Thank you, Mandy. Tammy Ryan.
Okay, thank you. I really don't have anything at this time. It's a lot of information to take in. Definitely, I'm one who kind of has to take a step back and kind of let things sink in a little bit more. So I'm not really at the moment, don't have anything like on the tip of my tongue or burning need to comment or bring anything forward. I will just echo what Mandy just said in regards to appreciation to the committee, everyone involved, and to Ventana for the modeling. I think that where we are today compared to where we started, I'm just really excited about the outcome here. And, obviously there's still a lot of work ahead of us, but to get to the point that we're at now and to be able to utilize the science of systems approach and structured decision making, I'm just feeling really good about where we are. Again, I know it's not perfect, and also this is an iterative process, so we're not done. But I just definitely am very appreciative to everyone to get us to the point where we're at. I just think this is a really remarkable effort.
Thank you, Tammy. Next then is Dan Storm.
Hi, just to try to, I guess, keep it a bit short and sweet. I think that especially like what this page that's being displayed here is that I think the bottom line from this effort, which is I think very impressive, but I think the bottom line from this is we're not going to do anything by nibbling around the edges. It's going to take hard choices, big drastic measures to have any chance of success. That seems to be what that's kind of what I gather from this. So I hope that if we get nothing else from this exercise, it's that we need to be serious about at least trying to be bold here in the future. So, but I really like this effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. And the last of our DNR committee members would be Jeff Pretzel.
Hey, thanks, Christine. I was the screen went away with that with the table, but the only question I had or comment I had as it related to that new foci column, it has relatively high prevalence rates, out into the future at the top until you get down to where you've got the new foci in the rows, where it drops off. But I guess my question is, are these assumed to be statewide trends relative to, obviously new foci would not be within the endemic area or even the leading edge? And is there a regional component to that, as in depending on where that new foci is? I mean, I think we see some different patterns based on some regional or landscape type influences that don't mean that the prevalence trend is going to be the same in all locations outside of the endemic area. And maybe there'll be some new things coming out of Dan's research that'll help feed that. But I was just curious, especially on those top cells with the relatively high prevalence rates, is that just anywhere, or is there a regional consideration?
That's a really good question. And here the new foci are not sort of statewide, but you could think of it as a representative township that gets some positives somewhere outside of kind of the core area. But if you think of it at kind of a larger spatial unit like a county, that new foci chunk is not going to represent the whole county. So a northern county that gets a couple of townships infected is not going to have these kinds of high prevalence numbers. And in addition, this is basically this township somewhere else looks like the endemic area in terms of its transmission parameters. Currently, we haven't had a chance to do the full uncertainty and consider the kinds of things that were in the north-south scenario. So if this were in a more favorable area due to sort of geography or deer density or something like that, you might see lower numbers here.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. That's kind of what I assumed.
Anything else, Jeff?
No, thanks. That's it.
All right, then moving on to representatives from our stakeholder groups. I don't believe we have anyone with NDA here today. So Justin from Wisconsin Wildlife Federation.
Yeah, thanks. I think I kind of said my piece. I think there still seems like there's a little bit of a disconnect between the model and with the deer density numbers, and it correlating, I guess, with the satisfaction or the resistance of implementation, because everything's driven on lowering the deer population number versus spreading them out. So that's the part where I still think we're always going to fight that uphill battle. And I think part of that is driven by having to have those conversations with those landowners. And so I think, we can do a lot of different activities. If it ultimately impacts his experience, then he naturally has a way to go out and recruit folks that are doing the same thing, that are causing a lot of the problems that we're having, versus having productive conversations so that we're getting better buy-in. So, because I think it impacts more than just the contact piece of it. I think it can hit 4 or 5 of those different variables, and you're doing it with a positive type of response. So that's the only piece that I see. Otherwise, I like a lot of the work and stuff that's here, and I think it does a good job of highlighting it.
Thank you, Justin. Wisconsin Bow Hunters Association, Bill.
Yes, this is Bill. I'd like to start out by saying that from what I've heard for the last 3 months from the committee, I think we've got some pretty good people working on this. And I can't imagine having a better team to come up with possibly the solutions to CWD here in Wisconsin. I just wanted to compliment the knowledge and the the insight of the people. I do think that we've covered everything well. I think we've made some pretty good steps toward progress in creating a final input document. And what I'm wondering about is when that goes to the CWD implementation team, will they make changes in the document? And how much of it do we think they will adopt? And then how will this determine or drive action by the DNR? I don't know if we can address those questions now, but I do think that that's something we need to be concerned about. And we need to hope that they will take the recommendations that our work determines what we come up with. I just think that we've done a good job. We've got the right people working on it, and I hope that our conclusions, our recommendations will be implemented by the DNR. Thank you.
Yeah, Bill, those are really good points, and I just wanted to address a couple of them real quick. So we have a lot of folks. I think half of the people from the implementation team are on this group, and that was done intentionally to make sure that there's a good transition of what's being done here to the implementation team. I think as far as changes, they won't be making any changes to the input document, but they will be developing a review. And that input document is a foundation, and really like the timeline for producing this review is very tight. And so there may be some refinements to the model, such as some adaptations or some revisions to parameter values based on data, or potentially additional model runs to look at some other scenarios that maybe we didn't have time to run here within the committee. But overall, you know, the work of this committee is the foundation of what they're doing. And, you know, I think that the people who are on this committee and also that team will continue the great work that everybody here has done and try to use it to the best of their ability.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Bill. Moving on then to Wisconsin Green Fire, Mike Samuel.
Yes, thanks. I am so delighted to see the involvement of Ventana and systems modeling in this whole approach. I think it's a potentially really powerful tool to help make better decisions about chronic wasting disease, especially in the long run. I think it needs to be improved, Tom, and I'm sure you probably don't just necessarily disagree with that, but I think it needs to, as best as possible, represent the current data and the current science for Wisconsin specific model. I think there's some of the science that could be better exploited, and perhaps some of the data, as I've tried to sort of show, could be better used to come up with more realistic approaches. Certainly, I think coordinating your efforts with the Southwest Deer study would be beneficial as well to informing some of the parameters and things that are in the model. So I think that sort of calibration to Wisconsin and some validation to the model would be the next steps that need to be done. In the meantime, I guess I would urge some caution about how the model is used. And I'm particularly concerned about this table you have up now, Jen. If this is part of the report, I think most people would argue that if we can get prevalence below 10% and maintain that, we have success. And I think the people who are opposed to any kind of management about chronic wasting disease will take this table and use it against you. That's been the history for the last 20 years of what's happened with disease. So I think you need to be very cautious about putting something like this out available. I certainly know that there are members on the Natural Resources Board that will point to this table and say, you know, it's useless, we should be doing nothing. So I would urge some thoughts about what's from this table and other tables in the report that are presented to the public. in terms of the future, I would really like to see the DNR implement some kind of pilot studies. And if the resources aren't available to do that across all three areas, the endemic, the leading edge, and the foci, then I hope you would get the committee's input about which of those areas might be the most beneficial, or some other way of evaluating where that work should start by implementing pilot studies and using an adaptive management approach along with the modeling effort to try to learn more about the uncertainties that we have and help to make better decisions, and not necessarily trying to deal with all the leading edge parts in the state or all the new foci in the state, but selectively choosing ones where we can see if our actions are pay off, and to learn about the system at the same time. So I think there would be a real benefit to taking that sort of an approach by the DNR. If we're really lucky, and if the congressional bills providing more funding for resources for chronic wasting disease research and management were available, the DNR might be able to tap into those to implement that program, or to expand the program to other parts of the state as well. But I think if we're just going to continue to do nothing, we're going to see pretty severe impacts on our deer populations that are going to just continue to spread throughout the rest of the state. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Next, then we have Whitetails of Wisconsin. Lori.
Yeah. So I looked through the action items that were sent to us the other day, and there's a lot of action items in regards to farm service, and several of them the DNR has no authority to act on because it would take legislative change. So I guess we're wondering why they shouldn't be removed, because there is no authority. Next, there were a lot of comments about depopulating all positive farms and ranches in Wisconsin. That's going to take somebody going to Washington, D.C. and finding some more money, because I'm a perfect example. I've been sitting here for 6 months waiting for the government to find indemnity money to depopulate my herd. So I'm all in favor of the people that want us depopulated to help us find the funding. You take Apple Creek as an example. They have over 2,000 animals. The government doesn't even have enough money to depopulate my herd of 300. So that's something that the people on this committee need to take into account. It's going to take a lot more funding. I would like to see more support for our CWD resistant research. We believe that we are on to the solution to chronic wasting disease. We can prove how fast we can breed away from CWD in a very short amount of time. I do have some charts from Dr. Nicholas Haley that I can share with you if anyone's interested, that can show how that's being accomplished at one of the positive hunting ranches here in Wisconsin. In the AFWA document, they list farm service movement as the highest risk of moving CWD. So if we remove that risk by getting to the point where we have CWD resistant animals, I would think everyone should be in favor of that, because we remove that risk. The map that Kurt sent this morning in that one document, the map of the zip codes from the people that hunted in the four most highly infected counties, put together by USGS, is powerful. To me, that shows that people most people no longer care about CWD. Otherwise, why are all of these people from northern Wisconsin and 49 other states hunting in those 4 most highly infected counties in Wisconsin? As to Mike Samuel's recent comment about the population in the endemic areas, I just sent Kurt an email that hopefully he can share with all of you. It shows the populations in these every county in Wisconsin from 2002 to 2020. And as an example, Richland and Sauk County are considered 2 of the 4 most highly infected areas of the state. The population from 2002 to 2020, the population has tripled. And let's compare that to Ashland County, where they're currently a non-detected county. Their population has dropped from that period of time. So we can no longer sit here and say that CWD is affecting the population, because it's not. It's never affected a population anywhere. It isn't a human health risk, and that's another thing I have issue with when we continue to do the scaremongering, when people have been unknowingly eating CWD infected animals for over 50 years and it's never affected humans. I think we're just scaring more people away from hunting. And it's never affected other animal species. So that's an important point too. And one of the things that we recently had said we'd like to see mandatory statewide testing for 1 year. I rethought that, and I guess I don't see any need to continue testing inside of the endemic area. We already know it's there, so we could use that money to test outside of the areas, because I know a 1 year mandatory testing is they're going to say we don't have the funds, but you know, if we diverted the funds from the endemic area and used it outside the endemic area, we could better utilize that money. And then I'd like to have us work together to for research to determine the different strains of CWD. Dr. Justin Grangley out of Ames, Iowa, will test these samples for free. He has research dollars from ARS. I'd really, really like to see if the farm cervids have a different strain of CWD than the wild, because we're not seeing a brain disease on the farms. You take Apple Creek Whitetails as an example. They've now had CWD in their farm for 5 to 6 years. I've been there numerous times. Those animals look tremendously healthy. If this truly is chronic wasting disease, why are we not seeing these animals with clinical signs? And then I also think we need to determine if the elk have a different strain than the deer, because possibly then we might not have that risk of the CWD transferring to the elk herd in Wisconsin. I think that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lori. And I did want to respond to your actions comment. So on the actions, we've verbatim included anything that anybody responded to. But as far as your comments on the regulations being outside of the DNR authority, that's why we also did include that column to indicate, whether each action, Kurt himself actually went through this, so thanks, Kurt, for doing this, but went through and classified every single action based on whether or not they were in DNR authority to implement.
Moving then on to our next committee member would be Jerome from Wisconsin Deer and Elk Farmers.
Thank you. The only thing I wanted to point out, and maybe to Mike, as far as modeling as well, and I think on slide 11, there was a notation of later likely detection in the north due to less surveillance. And if you increase surveillance, you'd probably increase fine or maybe not a fine. So historically, it seems to me that, yes, the endemic area is a high area of detection. And if you took the averages of surveillance animals tested from the farmland into the northern part, it's almost a five-fold difference. And so if there is likely to find it later in the leading edge areas or north of that, is trying to strategize in the model and, you know, the team take into effect how many animals should be surveilled in the leading edge and such. Because the difference is just over 500 to maybe 140 as a comparison. And so that would be an important thing to look at in the model. I don't know if that was considered or not. Surveillance on that leading edge being equalized to a percentage of fine, let's say. And then the other thing is just that, you know, I'm glad to be able to participate, but I think that, you know, the wild population, the wildlife groups, and everybody else here as a stakeholder, you know, we do have an awful lot to offer in the science that we pay for out of our private dollars and USDA dollars that can help in understanding the disease dynamics of what we're finding and what we're able to look at turning around. That could be helpful. It might not be in your belly whack right now, but it doesn't hurt to sit down and have a comparison as to Mike wanting to form a follow-up group to this. So I hope that the research team that's going to take this information on forward, and I also would want all the wildlife groups and the tribal nations to think about it as well, that we don't want it any more than you guys do, and we're here to help. And I thank you for the opportunity to provide input.
Thank you, Jerome. Real quick, I see that Dan Barr had a message or had a note on something that said earlier on the Apple Creek CWD animals. I just wanted to give him a chance to speak up.
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer. So for many of you that probably don't know who I am, I've been working at the Wisconsin Veterinary Diagnostic Lab since CWD was found in Wisconsin within the CWD testing lab. And just to circle back to Lori's comment about how come Apple Creek is not seeing any neurodegenerative disease in their animals. You know, I've never been there. I can't tell you what the animals look like on the hoof, but I can tell you that we've seen the very similar rates of CWD infection in the brain as we have with wild animals and captive animals from around the country. Some of those slides that I've looked at of the OBEX from these animals from Apple Creek, it just makes you wonder. I mean, they are, I guess what I'm trying to say is some of those animals have vacuolation and other neurodegenerative changes in the brain. So I mean, I can't sit here and say that you know, there's a particular strain in captive or wild. I'm not even sure if strain is the right term, but I guess the point I'm trying to make is that the captive animals that I've seen have had the same amount of spongy change and other changes in the OBEX. So it would be wonderful if, you know, I think Don Bates maybe 15 years ago had the idea of, you know, installing like a pop-up timer on a turkey. When they have CWD, the little thingy pops up, and then wouldn't that make life a lot easier? So sorry for the levity, but that's just me.
Thanks, Dan. We appreciate it. Thank you for that extra information. Okay, Christine, I think we have a few more folks.
I believe our last committee member to speak would be Redcliffe, Andy.
Yeah, good morning. Try to keep it brief as well. I just certainly appreciate the opportunity to participate on Redcliffe's behalf in the meetings, and very appreciative of the fact that throughout this process, DNR's had a lot of staff on and members of the implementation team that are charged with the tough task of taking this input document and, you know, helping it reshape the response plan at this point. And I hope that through this process, you've received useful information from the committee members. You know, the modeling, we all know, I think that, you know, the modeling is only as good as the questions that are asked and the data that goes into it. And, you know, at the outset, looking at some of the model results, it's, I guess, disheartening or a little frightening that not seeing as much change as we might like from some of the stuff that was modeled. But again, that goes back to, you know, what questions were asked and what data was used. So I think there was a wide range of options that were explored. And I, you know, hope the team takes those and looks at those output tables and, you know, is able to craft together some sort of response plan that, you know, takes advantage of the little opportunities that are there and turns them into something positive. And perhaps tried various different things, kind of like Mike was talking about, I believe, you know, maybe some pilot studies here and there, and see if we can really get some answers. And with that, I think that's all I have at this point. Again, just want to appreciate the opportunity to participate and enjoyed hearing the discussion and look forward to seeing what the changes to the plan may be and kind of evaluating from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andy. And I just wanted to double check, are there any stakeholder groups that I missed that may have joined late? All right, thank you.
Okay, so I think this is the time if anybody else wants to discuss anything in particular, let's on the results. I think let's do that now. And if not, the next step is we really want to bring the discussion and open it up to what are the key findings, what are the conclusions that this committee wants to make sure are heard by the DNR. So I think these two things can kind of meld at this point as well.
Hand up from Lori.
Could I make a comment and a question to Dan in regards to the testing at Apple Creek?
Yeah, Dan's one of our technical advisors, so should be able to comment.
So I understand these animals are showing the staining, but I just remember Dr. Don Davis from Texas A&M told me over and over again that unless we're not seeing holes in the brain, it's not a true TSE. So I'm just curious, Dan, has the DNR tested, opened up the brains and looked for holes on these positive, highly stained animals? I asked the Department of Ag if they would let me send brains down to Dr. Greenlee, but they're refusing to let me do that. But I think it's important. I want to know for sure that this is a true TSE.
Yeah, Laurie, I can certainly respond to that. And if anyone from the DNR on the committee needs me to stop talking, just let me know. So yes, the brain samples from Apple Creek, your farm, and all the other CWD positive deer farms in the state do have spongy changes. So that means that the prion accumulates around those neurons and essentially suffocates them, and those neurons die. And that's what causes, you know, that spongy appearance. And that occurs in the obex. That's why the obex is one of the samples that is mandatory to be collected under the CWD program standard. And all of the tissues that we receive or any diagnostic lab receives from a deer farm that are positive get sent to NVSL for confirmation. So your contact down in Ames would basically just have to walk across the parking lot, or fill out a request to have those tissues sent or available to him to do any further testing. And to respond to, does the Wisconsin DNR collect OBEX on all these animals? No, they do not, because studies have shown that if you have 100 positive CWD positive animals, 100% of them will be positive in the lymph node before they will be positive in the OBEX. And again, with that same 100 positive deer subset, about 80% would be positive in the OBEX. So given that information and the resources that are required to collect the OBEX, the decision was made long ago, 10 or 15 years ago, to only collect the lymph nodes from wild animals in Wisconsin. And I can tell you that it's very similar in most of the other states and wildlife agencies around the country.
But my question is, have you examined the entire brain? Have you cut the brain in half and examined for holes?
No, that's not how it works. So there aren't like giant voids in the cerebrum or the cerebellum. It's just these small neurons, which are basically like how can I put this? So if there's like an electrical cord, right, and you have to plug an electrical cord into a socket, these neurons are like the plugins. So if you cannot make that connection, then the animal can't function properly, and it will lose it'll lose the ability to do certain things. So we and every other diagnostic lab around the country that work for the USDA for CWD testing look at the OBEX, and the OBEX is where these changes occur. And that is basically that is the reason that the OBEX is tested on all these animals.
And I'm going to cut in here. If you guys want to keep having this conversation, that's great. But I think let's do it outside of the committee meeting so that we can have some of these bigger conversations about the messages. So thank you, Dan. Appreciate your insights.
No problem.
Okay. So yeah, now we are going to go through another roll call here. And basically, the goal here is to just have some discussions about the key insights. What are the takeaways that you want to make sure the DNR is aware of? Some of the things that I've been hearing, in this list that I'm compiling are pilot studies to experiment with various response strategies, refinement of the model, including some of the parameters, using new data, and also incorporating what is learned from the Southwest Project. Context-specific model runs, for example, like we did with North and South, to see if there are where we can leverage resources the most effectively in specific management or response contexts in different parts of the state. And then also potentially reallocating testing resources to outside the endemic area. All right, Christine, you want to go? Let's go ahead and do the roll call.
Sure, absolutely. I'll start again from the top of my list was DNR staff. Eric Canania.
Thanks, Christine. Looking over the response plan again, I just there's a lot of information here to digest, as Tammy said, and I'm the deer biologist for the southern part of the state, so kind of looking a little closely at the endemic area. Notice that many of our options, there are some slight changes, but not a lot. And the changes that can be made require a lot of dedication, a lot of time, a lot of money, and that are largely going to be not favorable to the hunters. And it just looking years and years in the future, I think it's imperative that we do what we can to make sure that the other parts of the state don't get to some of these levels that we are experiencing in the endemic area. So it's a lot of information to absorb, and I've still just taken a lot of it in.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Mandy Camps.
Well, I guess sitting here listening to the extra questions and conversation, I mean, I hear what Eric just was saying too, was that, different perspectives are going to come from different areas of the state. And thinking, I know for me, from my standpoint, thinking ahead with the implementation team coming up here and the best way to move forward with thinking about not just all of our stakeholder partners in the group here, but others that have a role one way or another in a type of CWD surveillance action as well in different areas of the state. So it's a lot to digest. I agree with that. I like the extra questions and points that were brought up for the future, other considerations that we can take into play or consider, whether it's with the model or other ways to look at data or other information to include. I guess I'm really at this point just interested to hear from all the other stakeholder groups as to see if there's anything else on this list. If the list is going to grow, like Jen, you had just ran through those extra ideas and see what else is coming up with. And I guess at this point, I don't want to take up too much time from my standpoint or the team standpoint I'm representing. I'm really curious to see what other stakeholders, if they have input that they want to add in yet at this point. So I might just leave it at that for now.
Thank you, Mandy. Tammy Ryan.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to defer to the members of the committee that are not with the DNR, because that's ultimately what the question is posed, and really looking forward to continuing to receive those that input and those ideas and contributions.
Sure, thank you, Tammy. Understood. I will give our other two DNR staff an opportunity to speak, though, if they would like still. Dan Storm.
Are you asking specifically my reaction to those ideas that were put forth just in the prior kind of segment? Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think what we're looking for at this point is as we develop the conclusion section of the input document, what are the things that the committee would like to see included in that section? I don't know if you have anything else to add, Jen.
Yeah, I was just going to say, so Dan, this can be some, you spoke about your conclusions and how this is, an indication that DNR needs to be bold, or we need to discuss some bold ideas. So what are some of those bold ideas, I think?
Oh, I mean, okay, in that case, I mean, what I was sort of getting at that was, as identified in those sort of scenarios and whatnot, I do agree with Mike's idea about trying to have some adaptive management scenarios if that's at all feasible. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I don't have much more reaction at this point then.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Jeff Pritzel.
Yes, I'm thinking about what we're learning and seeing and trying to make connections that will be relevant and tangible, to the average hunter. And one of the things I really think that this whole process is highlighting is a greater appreciation for the relationship of the density of animals to the behavior of the disease, and the density of animals and the relative impact that our hunting structure and strategy can have on that, and or should I say the lack of influence that we have on that. And I would just like to see an elevation of that appreciation of awareness of animal density and what it really, how that really plays out in both the hunter experience and the implications for disease trends, going forward, because there's just seems to me to be a big gap yet there, that until we bridge that gap and we maybe even move in the direction of exploring what does having older age structure, we talk about as a benefit or as a goal to increase age structure, which is just the way of saying increasing more animals with larger antlers. And until we culturally move past the infatuation with larger and larger antlers, I don't know how we make progress. And so I think we need to kind of help guide that cultural shift towards a new way of looking at what hunters really expect out of their experience. And it's not our job to dictate that or direct that. It's our job maybe to just guide it with better information. And a lot of the stuff that's coming to light here in these discussions, I think could be used to move us in the direction, whether it's, again, done voluntarily or just happens inevitably because we refuse to just acknowledge it.
Thanks, Jeff. Moving on then to our stakeholder groups, Wisconsin Wildlife Federation. Justin.
I think there's a component too that we should really acknowledge of where society is going, and not necessarily try to stop it, but try to get in front of it and use it to our advantage. Because I think too often when we try to stop it, we're met with greater resistance too. So I think there's a certain component of trying to understand where they're going and trying to be able to find a way to work within there. I think, the classic example, and I brought it up when we did the different modeling where I had, look, let your bucks live, but take your antlerless harvest down and what happens to the model. And I think, we were kind of surprised at it. Now, granted, there's a lot of folks that say, well, we never could do that. Well, we haven't tried to go down that path per se, but again, part of it is trying to get folks. I mean, to me, it's a lot easier if the hunting public is naturally going that way, to get them to buy into the process than saying we got to get them to reshift or what they prioritize today. So I think it's important that the department look at that. Where are they going, and how do we try to put that to our advantage versus trying to overcome it? I mean, I've said time and time again that piece about spreading the deer out component of it, but I would much rather see the deer spread out and have less uneven distribution on the landscape, because I think, number one, it's going to help us combat CWD, but it also makes it a lot easier. Instead of having to get more people to shoot an extra deer, I've given a whole bunch more people an opportunity to shoot a deer. And so just in that component in itself, I think is helpful. And again, you get more people. It's kind of the honey and vinegar. I mean, which one are you going to attract people to your side? And I think part of that, we can complain about it, but part of it is when we use too much vinegar, then folks go to legislators, and all of a sudden now we're losing tools or resources that were in our disposal in the past are no longer in our disposal. And so part of that is trying to find a healthy balance where folks don't necessarily jump down and say, well, the only way we're going to do this is going to be painful on our part. Part of it is teach them some of the benefits of of being able to do some things in a positive manner. And I think you'll get a lot more people on board.
Thank you, Justin. Wisconsin Bowhunters Association, Bill?
Yeah, hi, this is Bill. I think that when the final document comes out, what we need to do is to specify different, to let them know we identify different sections of the state. They have different needs, and that we can't paint the whole state with one brush. There has to be different situations, different rules applied to the different areas of the state. And I think we need to be specific in that and outline to the people that are getting our message, mainly the hunters, to let them know why we are doing it the way we are doing it. And I don't think we can just present the ideas and say, this is it. This is the way it's going to be done. I think we need to let them know why we're doing it this way so they can understand the background and where it's coming from. And perhaps then we're going to get, or I would hope anyway, perhaps then we would get better cooperation from the hunters in the state. I think we need to set different rules for different parts of the state and then explain why we implement the procedures that we suggest. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And next one would be Wisconsin Green Fire, Mike.
So 20 years ago, we viewed CWD as a novel disease in Wisconsin. That was the first we'd found it. First time it occurred east of the Mississippi River. 20 years later, it's no longer a novel disease, and we know what's going to happen with it. It's increased in prevalence, it's spread across the state, and there's no indication that that's not going to continue. And it appears to be within 20 years that we can pretty much reach prevalence that's about the maximum we're going to see in those populations of deer. The next phase we haven't not seen yet much of, and that is the impact on our deer herds. But everything we know from the infection rates and the mortality rates that the science says, and everything we know from CWD out in the West, is that those impacts are coming before long. So those predictions are basically higher impacts on males, younger age classes and less trophy bucks, and lower abundance of deer in general, and less, as Thomas sort of implied as well, that we begin to reduce hunting rates. I would really like to see the DNR no longer have Wisconsin no longer be used as the case study for the rest of the country of not doing anything about CWD. I think we need to find something that we can do in a positive manner to have an impact on this disease. If it's not in the endemic area because of the difficulties, I can understand that, but we have to make a concentrated effort to do something positive, either in the leading edge areas or the foci or the endemic areas, whatever seems like the best and most successful strategy to follow. And then, as I mentioned before, to try to combine that and learn about the disease and be able to make future decisions that are better, along with the modeling effort by Ventana. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Mike. Whitetails of Wisconsin, Lori.
I agree with Bill that we can't paint the whole state the same. We definitely have to handle areas that have too high of a density, different than, say, Ashland County, where the animal population is going backwards. I don't agree with Mike on the population. If you look at the studies from Wyoming, they use, there's a lot of other impacting on the population, and CWD plays very little in the population of Wyoming. Colorado hasn't noticed any population decline. I'll reiterate that the foremost highly infected counties in Wisconsin, they have doubled or tripled in population. So I think we're seeing the same thing inside of our fences. We're not seeing the classical CWD signs. We're not seeing a population decrease. I just think we're dealing with something different, or we would be seeing definite population declines. And then I also want to reiterate what Jerome said. We're here to help. We can be that solution to CWD. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. Then moving on to Jerome with Wisconsin Deer and Elk Farmers.
Yes, I applaud everything that's being built by Tom and the DNR in this modeling. We can only make the model better by having data input. It might not have everything in it and it might not be perfect, but I think, the DNR comes to us as stakeholders looking for what do we want to have as input into the model. And I think all the stakeholder groups, including ourselves, we all hunt. We all don't want to see CWD. So what I'd like to really see is how can we really help the DNR with, the inputs of surveillance. And so if all of our stakeholder groups goes back to your ranking files and your members at Deer Hunt, and try to get that 100% surveillance testing for CWD, because when we do that, we're able to improve the model because we know where things are going to be. Whether, yes, we know what the endemic area is, but I think it would go a long way and helpful to Bill's point of different parts of the state, that we might be able to capture a leading edge with more data input to improve the model. So then Mike Samuel's point of how do we accurately take the model to move it forward? Because the committee has to remember the one thing that we're here for is finding answers on how to reduce CWD on the landscape for deer and elk. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. Redcliffe, Andy.
Yeah, hi. I think just touch on one thing that was brought up earlier in discussion today, and that's, what this different modeling results or plans of action might actually mean for populations on the ground. And I think maybe it would be good to include that, as the implementation team comes up with a plan or two, or perhaps, a couple different plans of attacks for different scenarios that were going to be implemented, that it would be useful to the general public and the folks that are going to be affected by those to see some sort of bounds or percentages of what it might mean and changes to the deer population within those areas. As we've gone through this process, I think all of us kind of just took to believe that, at some level, this means that deer numbers are going to be reduced no matter what the plan of action was across the case. But it is an important thing to folks that are out there, whether they're hunters or not. And, I think including that as you move forward would be useful additional information that may buy you some support, may buy you some more grief. So thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Back to Kurt or Jen.
Yeah, so we were just discussing kind of the flavor of the comments we've gotten on the past two roll calls. It seems like it covers our agenda as far as the discussing model results, and we got a lot of that in the first round, but then some people did their key conclusions in the first round and the second round. So I guess what we're looking at here is maybe one last call for if there is something that committee member feels like is a key finding or conclusion that they have yet to say. Otherwise, we may be getting close to the end here and have a meeting that actually ends early for the first out of 7. So I guess what we'll do is we will open it up. So either raise hands or anyone to comment again on this key findings and conclusions part of it. We don't want anyone to feel like they missed their opportunity. So we'll open up to that right now. Go ahead, Mike.
I'm not clear what we're doing next, Kurt, or what the next step is. So related to key findings and conclusions, for example, is somebody going to draft something and the committee is going to review it, or are we done today and the DNR is going to go away and come up with the final conclusions? Where are these things headed?
Yeah, so these notes that we've taken during today's discussion will integrate into some narrative on those key conclusions. And we will share that with the committee before, or as well as with the implementation team. So there's, we're going to try to keep it as accurate to what's been said today as possible, but we'll allow you to provide some feedback on that if you see anything like truly astray. Does that sound reasonable to everybody?
And yeah, I guess as a reminder, I was going to say this at the end, but maybe I guess we're getting there. Then again, the implementation team is going to go through their step, use this input document as a key piece to what they're going through, and then the products from this next step, the implementation team, will be available for the committee to look at before it goes to approval for DNR leadership. So there will be that step that occurs as well. So I know you're specifically asking about this after today, Mike, but then there is that opportunity in the future after this second step. And as a reminder, we do have some email comments that came in from the non-attending members today that we will be incorporating into the document as well, just as Jen outlined in the same method.
Yeah, good point, Kurt. Sounds like I think we have a wrap here, Kurt.
All right. Yeah. So I guess I can see if Christine or Jen, if you have any concluding thoughts. Otherwise, yeah, I can wrap us up.
Not to let you get away too quickly, Kurt. Sorry.
Yeah, no, if you have something, this is what we're asking for. So go ahead, Mike.
It occurs to me that based on what we've seen, is that it's unlikely the DNR is going to be able to spread its resources across the 3 different zones that you've identified, the endemic, leading edge, and the foci. And I wonder if there's an opportunity for the DNR to get input from the committee about, does the committee have thoughts about some of those areas that may be either more important or more potentially successful or more maybe palatable to the hunting public and other parts of the public that might help provide some direction to the implementation team, and in the event that you have to focus on 1 or 2 of them rather than all 3.
Yeah, I think that's a valid topic for discussion right now. If anybody wants to provide any input on relative importance of the 3 across the 3 geographic areas.
Yeah, I think that would be a good opportunity now, as Jen said, and just as a reminder, I know, again, it's not exactly what you're saying, Mike, but there was the opportunity for each stakeholder group to give the relative importance of the objectives. You're asking geographically, of course, so that is something that I think could be talked about right now and could be something that goes into key conclusions.
Well, okay, so I'll go one step further and stick my neck out. And, within Greenfire, I think we discussed that that sort of priority. And I think that our conclusion was that the leading edge areas might be one of the best places to start, where prevalence still remains fairly low, where action items might have the most success at keeping prevalence low, and where action items may also be more palatable and receive more cooperation from the public and from the hunters in addition. I think beyond that, I guess there was a sense that the new foci would be an important component, and to particularly see if it's possible to either eradicate disease from new areas or to at least keep prevalence very low for a longer period of time. And then I think the endemic area was behind that, and not because it's not important, but I think because it's gone, as Tom Fitteman pointed out, the longer you wait on these things, the more challenging and the more difficult it becomes, and the more resource intensive it becomes. And so the chances of success there would be both difficult and also have to occur over a very extended period of time. So that was kind of our general thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's good points and good discussion point for any other committee members that want to chime in. I think it's interesting. You mentioned the chances of success or palatability, and that matches pretty well with that final column on that graph that we have the implementation challenges on for each one of these plans. So I think generally they're in the low to medium category as you get into leading edge and new foci. So yeah, I think that it definitely matches up with some of the results as well. Any other committee members want to comment on kind of this focus idea? Go ahead, Dan.
I think some of it though is does like say focusing efforts on a new foci, does that really preclude efforts other elsewhere? I mean, what's the limiting resource? We've got the most of the staff is local staff. So if we're going to have the local staff up their efforts on CWD in like their new foci in their county, it's probably at the expense of non-CWD activities, but it doesn't take anything away from staff in a different part of the state. So it kind of depends on what your resource is, I suppose, but I'm not sure that like there's the trade-offs of resource use are not as maybe don't seem to me, and now this is from my seat as the researcher who doesn't worry about life management budgets, but it doesn't seem to me like there's that a ton of trade-offs for these sorts of things. It may certainly be the case that we might think there's places where management actions might have a better shot, but in terms of having a certain action mean that it's at the expense of an action elsewhere, I'm not sure that's true.
I think that's, yeah, a good point. And as Jen, I think stated in the beginning, I mean, when we did this budget part, it is coarse. There's no doubt about it. And I think that's a good opportunity for the implementation team that goes a little bit deeper into the actions and some specifics to explore that budget side of things a little closer. So yeah, I think that's a good point to make.
Just to follow up on that, Dan, the reason that I said that is because some of the different plans focus somewhat more resources than others on, let's say, the leading edge, and as a result show different results. And so I agree with you that that whole part is a very puzzling to me as a researcher as well. But given that those trade-offs have to be made because of that limitation, which is in part the outcome of which I don't quite understand, That was sort of where I was coming along with the priorities.
Yeah, and I think it depends too. Some of these actions, I think you're correct that those trade-offs maybe not as apparent or maybe don't exist. For example, if you're looking at staff time allocation in different geographic areas for CWD response. But I think we were still considering, you know, if you're looking at payments for positives or some of these monetary, these monetary actions, that there may still be, there's probably still a cap, right, statewide for CWD response on some of these activities or testing, for example. So we're trying to capture that there are definitely some areas where we think there are trade-offs. And yeah, I agree with Kurt. I'd echo what he said. There's a lot more that could be done in this area. And I think it's something the CWD implementation team will certainly want to discuss further.
All right. Another call for comments on this specific subject, or just, again, key conclusions in general.
This is Jeff. I'm thinking about this idea of what can be done, or how would we focus on a leading edge that might do something different than what we've seen so far. You know, so for the kind of playing off of some of the things, you know, Mike has said and things that Lori brought up, you know, over the last 20 years, there has not been an interest or ability in the hunting community that was at the leading edge at the time to take action, you know, voluntarily based on our recommendations. And you have to wonder, human nature being what it is, that will the current leading edge hunters be inspired to collaborate, cooperate, and follow guidance and allow actions to be modified when we yet don't have that tangible aspect, that, you know, the difference between what Mike said and what Lori's observing, that from a population impact standpoint, you know, we're projecting that's yet to come, and we're trying to be proactive about it and take the action before it happens, because it hasn't. But when it does, will that be the inspiration that will change the mindsets and inspire more collaboration, I guess? And so, thinking that, if I am understanding it right, the modeling projection is saying that at some point in time prevalence does plateau, and that we might almost be there in a couple of places in the worst area. It seems like letting that's going to have to play out, and that's where we're going to draw the tangible evidence that may become the inspiration to change our direction on certain things, or support a conversation to go that route. I like a lot of the things that Justin acknowledged, you know, after my comment. I agree with him. The angle of, though, density, dispersal of animals to address that density thing, I mean, conceptually that's great. How we would get there, you know, obviously from a habitat manipulation management aspect, is a decades-long process, if it's even possible, unless in Justin's thoughts on it are more immediate in using artificial food sources to increase that distribution. Interesting discussion to have down the road, but I appreciate the recognition of getting the public to cooperate, and the you know, using the honey versus vinegar analogy. He's right about that. But how are we going to get there? And I guess I wouldn't call it honey, but the evidence of, and again, I Mike said too, I don't like the idea of Wisconsin being the petri dish for the country or even for the rest of the state, but it certainly feels like we're going to, some of that's going to play out, and our best move is to really watch it and monitor it so that we can enlighten future discussions on what it really does mean. Because right now people are not grabbing, what they, I think, is tangible evidence to inspire them to look at it differently. So long way of going. I agree with the invest in the leading edge, but continue to really track what's going on in the endemic area.
I think Lori had her hand up first.
Our association does a lot of sports shows in Wisconsin. So we hear a lot of comments from hunters, and I can tell you the majority of them don't care about CWD anymore. They're tired of hearing about it. What they do care about is losing the right to bait and feed. And that's why there's very little participation in counties that haven't found CWD yet, because there's no incentive. All it is you're penalized once they find the disease in your county. I glanced through the document that Kurt sent this morning, and I see a lot of comments from the hunters. They're not testing the animal because they don't care if their animal has CWD. They're going to eat it anyway. So you're not going to gain more support from the general public because they're tired of hearing about CWD. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. I see Justin, your hand's up.
I think there's a lot of ways where we kind of miss our opportunity to connect, I guess, with the public that we're trying to influence. And I think part of it is, going back to where it's going. I think look at the amount of consultants and folks out there right now that folks are just, we got a free consultation program essentially with the DMAP program, but yet these landowners are paying $2,000-3,000 just to have somebody come in and talk to them. And I think part of it, it behooved the department staff to probably look at a few of those folks and try to figure out what they're offering to the public that the department's missing out on. And I could probably list off a dozen of those folks. One guy that comes to mind is probably Jeff Sturgis from Whitetail Habitat Solutions. But look at the overall concept that they're trying to teach these individuals. And it goes back to, we see it coming up in all our data, right? Where people are working to keep deer on their property and not necessarily on the neighbors. These low impact type hunting strategies that allow the deer to kind of maintain their deer movement process even as pressure goes up. So I think a lot of those things are important and starting to work them into each level of it. So to give you an example, managed forest law, right? What kind of practices can these folks understand and incorporate and talk about these landowners on how to be able to hunt their property more efficiently and effectively so that they're not driving deer all out of their property? Because I think that's a key component of it, right? If we're looking at contact rates and stuff like that, the worst thing we can have happen is the deer within a 1 square mile are only utilizing a very small fraction of that because they find the habitat and the structure and the pressure not there. So we see it now as bow hunting has continually increased, right? That pressure is getting introduced earlier and earlier into the process. And by the time gun hunting comes around, the deer have found the places where they're not going to have that pressure. And so part of it is whether it's DMAP, whether it's the managed forest crop program, whether it's even just the forestry folks, part of that is kind of helping understand kind of where that place is going and kind of trying to fill that role so that you have property owners that are more willing to help assist us in the process because they're also benefiting from it. So, you know, if you have 100 deer over that square mile, you know, I want everybody within that square mile harvesting deer, not just in the bottom corner of it. And in a lot of cases, that's what we have, and that's creating the problems that we have today.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks for those comments. I'm wearing my DMAP hat, so appreciate hearing about that program. Anything else from committee members, again, in regards to current conversation or more conclusions to discuss?
I wanted to ask Dan Storm for his input on the question that Lori Seal raised and cited the science literature incorrectly. Dan, what is your take on what the science says and what your studies say about the effect of CWD on mortality of deer and the potential for population impacts?
Yeah, I mean, that's what the ultimate question of the Southwest project, Southwest deer CWD predator project is trying to answer. What is the ultimate impact of chronic wasting disease on deer populations, which would mostly manifest through increased survival of increased mortality, decreased survival of CWD positive deer. And so the preliminary results that we have so far is that CWD positive deer have a much lower survival rate on an annual basis than deer that don't have CWD. To the point of, well, you know, the deer populations have been increasing in those highest prevalence counties. That speaks to the fact that CWD isn't the only thing that influences deer populations. Harvest is a huge factor and probably still the biggest factor at the moment. And the harvest rates, since the discovery of CWD, harvest rates have gone down, and the harvest rates that we're measuring on our female, our does are quite low. And so the reason that one of the reasons that the deer population can potentially grow or not decline in spite of these high prevalences is the fact that our harvest rates are so low. So you can't just look at CWD. You can't just look at, well, CWD and deer population abundance and say, here's your story. You have to look at a lot of different things. And so, yeah, and the how the population will manifest in terms of its population size trajectory over time isn't just CWD mortality. It's other things. It's recruitment as well. But principally, I think what the story is that our harvest rates, especially on females, have just really gone down in those areas. And that's why we still have abundant deer populations.
And what's your take on the science, the radiotelemetry studies and related studies in the West about the impact of CWD on populations there?
Yeah, there's a new study that just came out, or a new, I guess, analysis of some data in Colorado, and I haven't dug into it yet. In Wyoming, they've studied CWD, basically done similar studies to what we're doing now, where they looked at CWD as a factor in deer survival and what the impact on the population will be, and they find that CWD, again, like you'd expect, CWD positive deer have a much lower survival rate, and they estimate, and I forget what the prevalence that they estimate that actually the CWD itself would be driving the deer population a decline. I believe it's like 40% or so, but I know that they are observing, experiencing CWD impacts on deer populations in Wyoming, at least in those studies.
All right, thanks for that. Yeah, I see Lori's hand up. One thing I will say is these studies that keep being referenced are out there for everyone to look at and assess the results themselves. And as Dan said, and Jeff kind of alluded to, there's more to come, more research that will come out on impacts and the relationship when it comes to deer populations. But Lori, you have comment?
Yeah, I'll gladly share what I've seen on the Wyoming. It will take me a little bit of digging to find, but they concluded that it was predation, urban sprawl, a number of other things, and CWD was way down on the bottom on the one that I saw.
Okay, thanks. And again, like I say, these research projects are papers are out there for people to read and look at the results as they're written. So I'm not sure if this is the third or fourth time I've done this, but another call for comments. I just want to be sure that we're good. All right, well, I will take that step to wrap us up. One thing I did mention, I think in regards to one of Mike's comments about kind of the next steps, I do want to remind, as we talked about in one of our previous meetings in the charter, there is that year 2 and 3 identified for the committee. And as we talked about last time, that's still what exactly that looks like is being developed, but we'll keep the committee informed as those plans get more solidified. But we do know that the model will be a part of next year's process with that continued development and improvements based on new information available, hopefully new information that we've been talking about today. So there is that part of the committee process as well. And again, we'll just keep in communication on that. So to finally wrap this up, just again, as I said in the beginning, because I didn't want it to get lost, just really appreciate working with everyone on this process. And really, I think it's something for everyone to take a step back and again, look at the product that came out of this and where we started. And CWD, a tough thing to work with, as we've made apparent through this whole process of all the different factors that are at play. But then again, learning a new process, or again, a new process to most of us with structured decision making, and using that as a tool, and then learning the model process through these steps as well. Definitely was a lot to take in, and you all took a lot of your time to do this, and it's really appreciated. And I think a pretty cool thing, and again, something to really look at the impact that you've had, and this input's gonna help with the rest of the review. So with that, I know we have done a lot of work and a lot of pre-work through this process. The last pre-work I will leave everyone with the group with is to not think about CWD, at least for one evening, and just take a break and relax from all this. But again, appreciate everyone's time and this whole process. And I think, unless Jen and Christine have anything, or Tom as well, I think we can wrap this up.
Thanks, Kurt. Thanks, everyone. Appreciate all your work and your engagement on this. I know it was a lot of effort, and so your efforts have not been ignored, and we just really appreciate the opportunity to work with you. And this process isn't over, so we'll continue bringing your work forward and using it to the best of our ability to help inform management decisions. So thank you.
Yes, Kurt and Jen said it well, but thank you all for your time and commitment to the process, and looking forward to the next step.
All right. Thank you all. You can go ahead and stop recording, Dan, and wrap it up whenever you can.